The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of Henderson's general store, and Evelyn Mercer felt her stomach drop for the 100th time that week. 7 days of frozen hell across endless plains had brought her here, to Red Hollow, Wyoming territory, where the wind cut like broken glass and the mud never seemed to dry. She pressed her gloved hand against the frosted window, peering out at the town that was supposed to be her salvation. It looked exactly like desperation always did, rough, mean, unforgiving. "This is your stop, ma'am," the driver called down, his voice carrying that particular tone men used when they pitied you but didn't want to get involved. "Red Hollow. End of the line." Evelyn gathered her belongings, one weathered suitcase held together with leather straps, one carpet bag containing her mother's Bible and 3 dresses she'd stitched herself, and a heart so full of hope it actually hurt to breathe. She'd left everything behind in Philadelphia, the boarding house where landladies whispered about her size, the factory job that paid barely enough to eat, the endless parade of men who looked through her like she was furniture. But Conrad Whitmore's letters had promised something different, a fresh start, a ranch in the mountains, a husband who claimed he wanted a sturdy woman capable of frontier life rather than some delicate flower who'd wilt at the first hardship. His words had felt like a lifeline. Now, stepping down into the muddy street with her suitcase banging against her knees, Evelyn scanned the crowd for the man who'd written those beautiful letters. The man who'd sent a train ticket and explicit instructions to meet him at Henderson's store at 2 o'clock on the 15th of March. It was 2:15. The street was full of people, but none of them were looking at her the way a man looked at his future bride. Instead, she saw something worse. The quick flicker of eyes, the whispered comments behind hands, the barely concealed smirks of young cowboys loitering outside the saloon. A woman in an expensive wool coat paused mid-conversation to stare. Then she leaned toward her companion and whispered something that made both of them laugh. Evelyn's cheeks burned. She knew that look, had seen it her entire life. The look that said, "That's her? That's the one? Lord have mercy." She straightened her spine and lifted her chin. She'd survived worse than small-town gossip. She'd survived poverty, abandonment, and the special kind of cruelty that people reserved for women whose bodies didn't match their expectations. She could survive this too. "Excuse me," she said, approaching a middle-aged man sweeping the storefront. "I'm looking for Conrad Whitmore. He was supposed to meet me here this afternoon." The man stopped sweeping. He looked her up and down slowly, his expression shifting from neutral to something uglier. "Conrad Whitmore, you say?" "Yes, I'm his... We're supposed to be married." A younger man who'd been loading grain sacks onto a wagon turned around fast. "You're the mail-order bride?" Evelyn's throat tightened. She hated that term, mail-order bride, like she was a piece of merchandise shipped across the country in a wooden crate. But technically, that's exactly what she was. "I'm Evelyn Mercer," she said firmly. "Mr. Whitmore and I have been corresponding for 6 months. He invited me to Red Hollow to marry him, yeah." The younger man set down the grain sack and whistled low. "Well, I'll be damned. Conrad actually went through with it." Something in his tone made Evelyn's stomach twist. Went through with what? The 2 men exchanged a look. The older one cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I think you better come inside. There's something you need to know." That's when Evelyn understood. Conrad Whitmore wasn't late. He wasn't coming at all. The inside of Henderson's general store smelled like leather, coffee, and sawdust. Mr. Henderson, the owner, poured her a cup of weak tea and gestured toward a wooden chair near the stove. Evelyn sat down carefully, feeling the weight of every eye in the store pressing against her back. "Conrad left town about 6 weeks ago," Henderson said, not unkindly. "Sold most of his ranch to a cattleman from Denver and headed south. Last anyone heard, he was in Santa Fe trying his luck at the gambling tables." Evelyn's hands trembled around the teacup. "That's impossible. He sent me a letter just 2 months ago. He said..." "Whatever he said, ma'am, I'm sorry to tell you it wasn't true." Henderson rubbed the back of his neck uncomfortably. "Conrad's been in debt for over a year. Lost most of his cattle in the winter of '83. The bank was about to foreclose when that Denver rancher made him an offer. Conrad took the money and ran." The younger man from outside, he'd followed them in, clearly enjoying the drama, leaned against the counter. "What Henderson ain't saying is that Conrad talked about you all over town for weeks. showed folks your photograph, bragged about finding himself a bride who'd work hard and not complain too much. Evelyn felt like she'd been punched in the chest. He showed people my photograph? Sure did. Passed it around the saloon one night when he was drunk. Said you looked like a woman who could handle ranch work. The young man's grin turned nasty. Of course, once he sobered up and really looked at that picture, guess he decided frontier life wasn't for him after all. Took off before you even crossed the Missouri River. Someone near the back of the store snickered. Evelyn set down the teacup before her shaking hand spilled it. Every nightmare she'd ever had about coming west was coming true in this moment. She'd traveled over 1,000 miles to marry a man who'd taken one look at her photograph and fled the territory. The humiliation burned worse than frostbite. I see, she said quietly. Thank you for telling me. She stood up, gathered her suitcase and carpet bag, and walked out of that store with her head high, even though her entire world was collapsing. Behind her, she heard the whispers starting immediately. Poor thing. What's she going to do now? Can't believe Conrad ran like that? Well, can you blame him? That last comment hit like a knife between her ribs. Outside, the cold wind slapped her face and dried the tears before they could fall. Evelyn stood in the middle of that muddy street, surrounded by strangers in a town that had already decided she was a joke, and realized she had approximately $14 to her name, no return ticket, and nowhere to go. A group of cowboys across the street were watching her. One of them said something that made the others laugh. Another tipped his hat mockingly. Evelyn turned away and started walking. She didn't know where she was going, just away from the store, away from the laughter, away from the stares that stripped her down to nothing but her failures. She found herself in front of a saloon called the Silver Spur. A hand-painted sign in the window read, "Rooms for rent, weekly rates." It was the only option she had. The room above the saloon was barely larger than a closet. A narrow bed with a thin mattress, a wash basin, a cracked mirror, and a single window that looked out over the alley where men pissed against the back wall of the feed store. The sounds of the saloon below, rough voices, breaking glass, the tinny piano that never quite played in tune, vibrated through the floorboards like a constant reminder of where she'd ended up. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and finally let herself cry. She'd been so stupid, so desperate, so willing to believe that Conrad Whitmore's letters were real instead of what they obviously were. The lies of a man who needed a workhorse and thought he could import one from back east. The worst part wasn't even Conrad's abandonment. The worst part was knowing that she'd done this to herself. She'd read those letters and chosen to see what she wanted to see instead of what was actually there. Every line about needing a practical woman and a steady companion had been code she'd deliberately ignored. Because the truth was too painful. Conrad Whitmore had never wanted a wife. He'd wanted unpaid labor with a ring attached. And when he'd finally looked at her photograph, really looked at it, he'd realized that even that wasn't worth the embarrassment of being seen with someone like her. A knock at the door made her jump. "Miss Mercer?" A woman's voice, rough from whiskey and cigarettes. "I'm Rose. I run the rooms here. Just wanted to check if you need anything." Evelyn wiped her face quickly and opened the door. Rose was older, maybe 50, with red hair fading to gray and a face that had seen every kind of trouble the frontier could offer. "I'm fine, thank you." Rose looked her over with shrewd eyes. "No, you ain't, but that's all right. Nobody who ends up in one of my rooms is fine. You eaten today?" "I'm not hungry." "Didn't ask if you were hungry, asked if you'd eaten." Rose crossed her arms. "Come on downstairs when you're ready. I'll have the kitchen make you something. On the house." Before Evelyn could refuse, Rose headed back down the stairs. Her kindness, small as it was, nearly made Evelyn start crying again. She splashed water on her face from the basin, straightened her dress, and forced herself to breathe. She'd figure this out. She'd survived worse. Back in Philadelphia, she'd once gone 3 days without eating because the rent was due. She'd worked 14-hour shifts in factories where the air was so thick with cotton dust you could barely breathe. She'd endured the constant, casual cruelty of a world that judged women by their waistlines and their wedding rings. This was just one more humiliation in a lifetime of them. She could survive it. She had to. Downstairs, the saloon was starting to fill with evening customers. Men crowded around tables, playing cards, drinking whiskey, and talking loud enough to drown out the struggling piano. Rose had saved a small table near the kitchen, away from the worst of the noise. She brought Evelyn a plate of stew, bread, and weak coffee. Eat. Then we'll figure out what comes next. I can pay, Evelyn said quickly. I have money for rent. I know you do. Saw you counting it upstairs through the floorboards. Rose sat down across from her. How much you got? $10? $15? $14.30. That'll get you 2 weeks here, maybe 3 if you're careful. Then what? Evelyn had been avoiding that exact question. I'll find work. Doing what? There ain't exactly a lot of jobs for respectable women in Red Hollow. You can sew? Some. Cook? Enough to get by. Rose nodded slowly. Might be able to get you some mending work, maybe washing. Won't pay much, but it'll keep you fed. She paused. That is, if you're planning to stay. Most women in your situation head back east soon as they can scrape together the fare. Evelyn looked down at her stew. Going back east meant returning to the same poverty and loneliness she'd fled. At least here, nobody knew her history. Nobody knew she'd already failed at everything else before failing at this. I'm staying, she said. Then you're tougher than you look. Rose stood up. Finish eating, and don't pay attention to the jackasses at the bar. Half of them got rejected by mail-order brides themselves. They're just glad it's someone else this time. That night, lying in the narrow bed while the saloon roared below, Evelyn made herself a promise. She would not let Red Hollow destroy her. She would not slink back east with her tail between her legs. She would survive this place, earn enough money to move on, and never again trust a man who claimed to see value in her. She'd learned her lesson. She was done hoping for rescue. The next morning, Evelyn woke to pounding on her door, and Rose's voice shouting through the wood. Miss Mercer, you decent? Need to talk to you. Evelyn pulled on her dress and opened the door. Rose looked flustered, which seemed out of character for a woman who ran a saloon. There's a man downstairs asking for you. Big fella. Mountain rancher. Says his name is Gideon Cross. Evelyn's stomach dropped. I don't know anyone by that name. Well, he knows you, or knows about you anyway. Says he needs to speak with you about a business proposition. Rose lowered her voice. Listen, Gideon Cross ain't a man you refuse lightly. He's got a reputation. Keeps to himself up in the Blackstone Range, doesn't come down to town more than twice a year. If he's here asking for you specifically, there's a reason. What kind of reputation? Rose hesitated. The kind where people don't ask questions. He's fair, but he's hard. Lost his family years ago and hasn't been right since. Lives alone up in those mountains with just cattle and bad memories. She paused. But he's never hurt a woman, if that's what you're worried about. Whatever he wants, it ain't that. Evelyn didn't know what to think. A strange man showing up the morning after her humiliation felt like the beginning of an even worse disaster. But she also didn't have the luxury of being particular about opportunities. Tell him I'll be down in 10 minutes. Rose nodded and disappeared down the stairs. Evelyn splashed water on her face, pinned up her hair, and tried to calm her racing heart. A business proposition from a mountain rancher she'd never met. Nothing about that sounded promising. But nothing about the last 24 hours had been promising either. She went downstairs. Gideon Cross was impossible to miss. He stood near the saloon entrance, taking up space like a bear that had wandered down from the mountains and decided to wear human clothing. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that looked like they could carry a full-grown steer. His face was weathered and scarred, a jagged line running from his left eyebrow down to his jaw. Dark hair, dark eyes, and an expression that suggested he'd forgotten how to smile sometime around the turn of the century. He was terrifying. Evelyn approached slowly. Mr. Cross? I'm Evelyn Mercer. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he removed his hat. Miss Mercer, appreciate you coming down. I know this is unexpected. His voice was low and rough, like gravel sliding down a mountain. Not unkind exactly, but not warm either. Rose said you had a business proposition. I do. He glanced around the saloon, clearly uncomfortable with the audience they were attracting. But I'd prefer to discuss it somewhere more private. Would you be willing to walk with me? We won't go far. Just away from all these ears. Every instinct Evelyn had screamed at her not to go anywhere with this man, but Rose's words echoed in her head. He's never hurt a woman. And besides, what exactly did she have to lose at this point? All right, she said. They walked outside into the cold morning air. Gideon led her down the street toward the edge of town where a wagon and 2 horses waited. He didn't try to make small talk, which Evelyn appreciated. She was done with false pleasantries. Finally, near the wagon, he turned to face her. "I'm going to be direct, Miss Mercer, because I don't have patience for dancing around things. I heard what happened yesterday. Heard Conrad Whitmore abandoned you before you even arrived. Heard the whole damn town talking about it in the feed store like it was entertainment." Evelyn's cheeks burned with fresh humiliation. "I see. I also heard what some of those men said about you, about why Conrad left." His jaw tightened. "It made me angry." She didn't know what to say to that. This stranger's anger on her behalf felt more dangerous than comforting. "I live 40 miles north in the Blackstone Mountains," Gideon continued. "It's hard country, cold, isolated. I run cattle and keep to myself. Lost my wife and daughter 10 years ago to illness, and I haven't had anyone living up there since." Evelyn's throat tightened. She knew where this was going, and it made her want to scream. "Mr. Cross, if you're here to offer me some kind of arrangement because you think I'm desperate enough to—" "I'm offering you a job," he interrupted. "Not a marriage, not anything else. A job. I need help managing the household, and you need somewhere to stay while you figure out what comes next. You'd have your own room, your own space. I'd pay you fair wages and provide room and board. When you're ready to move on, I'll bring you back to town with enough money to get wherever you want to go." Evelyn stared at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because someone should have done it for my wife when she needed it." His voice went rough. "And because those bastards in the feed store don't get to decide what you're worth." For the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, Evelyn felt something other than humiliation. She felt seen. Not pitied, not mocked, just seen. But she was also practical enough to be suspicious. What's the catch? The catch is that the mountains will try to kill you every single day. It's brutal up there. The work is hard. The winters are worse. If you can't handle isolation and cold and danger, you won't last a week. He looked at her steadily. "But if you can handle it, you'll be safe. I give you my word on that." Evelyn looked back toward the saloon where she'd spent the night crying in a rented room above a bar. She thought about the 2 weeks of rent she could afford before she'd be back on the street. She thought about the whispers and the laughter and the way this town had already written her off as a joke. Then she looked at Gideon Cross, this scarred, dangerous stranger who'd ridden 40 miles through mountain passes to offer her a choice instead of pity. It was possibly the stupidest decision she'd ever made. "When do we leave?" she asked. Something flickered in Gideon's eyes. Not quite surprised, but close. "Within the hour. Weather's turning and I want to be in the foothills before nightfall. I'll get my things." She turned to go, but his voice stopped her. "Miss Mercer?" She looked back. "You're making the right choice." Evelyn wasn't sure about that, but she knew staying in Red Hollow would destroy her, and taking a chance with a mountain rancher couldn't possibly be worse than what she'd already survived. She went back to her room, packed her suitcase, and left $14 on the nightstand for Rose with a note that said simply, "Thank you." Then she climbed into Gideon Cross's wagon and didn't look back as Red Hollow disappeared behind them. The journey into the mountains was unlike anything Evelyn had experienced. The road, if it could even be called that, was little more than a rough trail carved through dense forest and rocky terrain. The higher they climbed, the colder it got. Snow still covered the ground in thick patches despite it being March, and the wind howled through the pine trees like something alive and angry. Gideon drove the wagon in silence, his attention focused entirely on navigating the treacherous path. Evelyn hugged her coat tighter and tried not to think about what she'd just done. She'd climbed into a wagon with a complete stranger and was now heading into the wilderness where no one would hear her scream. If Rose's assessment of Gideon Cross was wrong, Evelyn was about to pay for that mistake with her life. But as the hours passed and Gideon remained focused on the road rather than on her, Evelyn's fear began to shift into something else. Exhaustion, maybe. Or resignation. She'd spent so much energy being afraid for so long that she didn't have the strength to sustain it anymore. "Storm's coming," Gideon said suddenly, breaking the hours-long silence. "Can smell it in the air. We'll need to push harder." "How much farther?" Evelyn asked. "Another 2 hours if the weather holds, 4 if it doesn't." He glanced at her briefly. "You cold?" "I'm fine." That's not what I asked. Evelyn hesitated. Yes, I'm cold. Without a word, Gideon reached behind the wagon seat and pulled out a heavy wool blanket. He handed it to her. Wrap up. It'll get worse before it gets better. She took the blanket, surprised by the gesture. Thank you. He just nodded and returned his attention to the trail. They rode in silence for another hour before the storm hit. It came fast and vicious, wind that nearly knocked the wagon sideways, snow that turned the world into a blinding white wall, and cold that sank into Evelyn's bones despite the blanket. She could barely see 5 feet in front of them. Hold on, Gideon said, his voice cutting through the wind. This part gets rough. Rough was an understatement. The wagon tilted dangerously as they navigated a narrow cliff edge, and Evelyn gripped the seat so hard her knuckles went white. One wrong move and they'd plunge hundreds of feet into the ravine below. But Gideon's hands were steady on the reins. He guided the horses with calm precision, never hesitating, never panicking. Whatever else he was, the man knew these mountains. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of frozen hell, buildings appeared through the snow. A cabin, a barn, and several outbuildings, all tucked into a clearing surrounded by towering pines. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows. We're here, Gideon said. He brought the wagon to a stop near the cabin and jumped down. Then, before Evelyn could even move, he reached up and lifted her down from the seat like she weighed nothing. His hands were strong and sure, and he set her on her feet with surprising gentleness. Get inside, he said. I'll bring your things. Evelyn didn't argue. She stumbled toward the cabin door, pushed it open, and stepped into warmth that hit her like a physical force. The cabin was simple but solid. Wooden floors, stone fireplace, handmade furniture that looked built to last 100 years. Everything was clean and organized, which surprised her given that a man lived here alone. Gideon came in behind her, carrying her suitcase and carpet bag. He set them down near the door and moved immediately to the fireplace, adding more wood to the flames. Your room is through there, he said, gesturing toward a door on the far wall. It's got a bed, a dresser, and a stove for heat. I already got it warm for you. He straightened up and looked at her directly for the first time since they'd arrived. You're safe here, Miss Mercer. I know you got no reason to believe that yet, but you will. I don't break my word. Evelyn nodded slowly, still trying to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow the real work starts. For tonight, just rest. There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry. Help yourself to whatever you need. Then he grabbed his coat and headed back out into the storm, presumably to tend to the horses and secure the barn. Evelyn stood alone in the cabin, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle inside, and realized that for the first time since arriving in Wyoming territory, she wasn't afraid. She was still humiliated, still heartbroken, still uncertain about everything, but she wasn't afraid. And that was something. Basab. Evelyn woke the next morning to the sound of an axe hitting wood. She sat up slowly, disoriented by the unfamiliar room. Gray light filtered through a small window, and she could see her breath in the cold air despite the stove in the corner still radiating some heat. She dressed quickly in her warmest clothes and ventured out into the main room. The cabin was empty, but coffee was warming on the stove and bread sat on the table alongside butter and jam. A note in rough handwriting read, Eat, then come find me. G. Evelyn poured herself coffee and ate standing up, staring out the window at the landscape that was now her reality. Snow-covered pines stretched in every direction, broken only by the cleared areas around the cabin and barn. Mountains rose in the distance like jagged teeth against the pale sky. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. She found Gideon behind the barn, chopping wood with mechanical efficiency. Each swing of the axe split the logs cleanly, and he moved like a man who'd been doing this his entire life. He paused when he saw her approaching and drove the axe into the chopping block. Morning, he said. You sleep all right? Well enough. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter. What do you need me to do? Gideon studied her for a moment, as if trying to gauge how serious she was. Can you carry water? Yes. Then we'll start there. 2 buckets from the well to the cabin. 5 trips should fill the reservoir. After that, I'll teach you how to check the livestock and tend the chickens. It sounded simple enough. Evelyn nodded and followed him to the well. 5 trips later, she understood that nothing about frontier life was simple. The buckets were heavy, the snow made walking treacherous. By the third trip, her arms were shaking. By the fifth, she could barely lift the buckets high enough to pour them into the reservoir. Gideon watched her struggle, but never offered to help, which irritated her until she realized he was testing her. He wanted to know if she'd quit. She didn't. "Good," he said when she finished. "Now the chickens." He led her to a coop behind the cabin where a dozen hens clucked irritably at the intrusion. Gideon showed her how to collect eggs, check for predators, and distribute feed. His instructions were clear and practical, with no wasted words. "Chickens are stupid, but useful," he said. "Keep them fed and safe. They'll keep you fed in return. Let a fox get in here, and you'll lose them all in one night." "How do I keep foxes out?" "Make sure the coop is secured every night before dark. Check for gaps in the wood. Set traps if you have to." He paused. "You know how to set a trap?" "No?" "I'll teach you." And he did. Over the next several hours, Gideon taught Evelyn more about survival than she'd learned in her entire life. How to read animal tracks in the snow, how to identify which plants were safe to eat, how to tell when weather was turning dangerous, how to load and fire a rifle. That last one surprised her. "I don't need to know how to shoot," she protested when he handed her the weapon. "Yes, you do. Bears come down from the high country sometimes. Wolves, too. You need to be able to protect yourself if I'm not here." "Where would you be?" "Checking fence lines, moving cattle, could be gone for days at a time." The thought of being alone in this cabin, surrounded by wilderness and predators, made Evelyn's stomach twist. But she took the rifle and let Gideon show her how to hold it properly, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. She missed her first 6 shots. "Try again," Gideon said. She did. By sunset, Evelyn was exhausted in ways she'd never experienced. Her arms ached, her legs trembled, her hands were red and raw from the cold and the work. But she'd carried water, fed chickens, set traps, and managed to hit a tree trunk from 20 yards away. Gideon made dinner, venison stew with potatoes and carrots, and they ate in silence at the rough wooden table. Evelyn was too tired to make conversation, and Gideon didn't seem inclined toward it anyway. Finally, as she was washing dishes, he spoke. "You did well today." Evelyn nearly dropped the plate she was holding. "Thank you. Most people quit after the water. You didn't. I'm not most people." Something that might have been a smile flickered across Gideon's face and then disappeared. "No, I don't suppose you are." That night, lying in bed with every muscle screaming, Evelyn realized something strange. Despite the hardship, despite the exhaustion, despite the uncertainty, she felt more alive than she had in years. Red Hollow and Conrad Whitmore felt like a distant nightmare. The mountains were brutal, but at least they were honest about it. The first week nearly broke her. Not because Gideon was cruel, he wasn't. Not because the work was impossible, it was just relentless. What nearly destroyed Evelyn was the sheer, suffocating isolation of the mountains. Back in Philadelphia, she'd been lonely, but she'd been lonely surrounded by people. Here, the silence was so complete it felt like a physical presence. Some mornings she'd wake up and realize she hadn't heard another human voice in 2 full days because Gideon had been out checking fence lines in the high country. The third morning, she burned breakfast so badly the cabin filled with smoke. The 5th morning, she slipped on ice while carrying water and both buckets went flying, soaking her dress and leaving her sitting in a frozen puddle while tears of frustration streamed down her face. The 7th morning, she woke up before dawn and seriously considered just walking down the mountain road back to Red Hollow, consequences be damned. But she didn't, partly because she was too stubborn to quit, partly because she had nowhere else to go, but mostly because Gideon never once made her feel stupid for failing. When she burned breakfast, he just scraped the pan clean and said, "Cast iron holds heat longer than you think. Keep the flame lower." When she spilled the water, he handed her a dry coat and showed her how to walk on ice without falling. And when she was so exhausted she could barely lift her arms, he'd take over whatever task she was struggling with and say, "That's enough for today. Rest." He didn't coddle her, but he didn't mock her either. And for a woman who'd spent her entire life being mocked, that difference meant everything. By the end of the 2nd week, Evelyn's hands had developed calluses thick enough that she could split kindling without gloves. She could carry 2 full water buckets from the well without stopping to rest. She could gut a fish, pluck a chicken, and load a rifle in under 30 seconds. The soft woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach in Red Hollow was disappearing, replaced by someone harder and more capable. Someone who was starting to understand why Gideon had chosen this brutal isolation. Up here, nobody judged you. Nobody whispered. Nobody compared you to some impossible standard you'd never meet. The mountains didn't care what you looked like or where you came from. They only cared whether you were strong enough to survive them. And Evelyn was discovering she was stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever believed. One afternoon in late March, while Evelyn was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, she heard horses approaching. Her heart jumped into her throat. In 2 weeks, nobody had come up the mountain. Gideon had told her that visitors were rare this time of year, and anyone who showed up unannounced was either lost or looking for trouble. She ran inside and grabbed the rifle Gideon kept loaded by the door. Her hands were shaking, but she managed to position herself near the window where she could see the riders without being seen. 3 men on horseback emerged from the tree line. They looked rough, the kind of men who spent more time in saloons than churches. One of them was laughing about something. Another was passing a bottle back and forth with the third. Evelyn's pulse hammered in her ears. Where was Gideon? He'd left at dawn to check the north pasture and hadn't said when he'd be back. The men rode right up to the cabin like they owned it. The one in front, a thick-necked man with a red beard, dismounted and walked up to the door like he was about to knock. Evelyn stepped out onto the porch with the rifle raised. "That's far enough," she said, proud that her voice didn't shake even though her hands wanted to. Redbeard stopped mid-reach and turned to look at her. His eyes widened slightly when he saw the rifle, then narrowed with amusement. "Well now, Gideon didn't mention he had a woman up here. Mr. Cross isn't here right now. State your business or leave." The other 2 riders had dismounted now and were looking at her with expressions that made Evelyn's skin crawl. One of them, a thin man with a scar across his cheek, grinned. "Ain't you the mail-order bride from Red Hollow, the one Conrad Whitmore ran from?" Evelyn's stomach dropped, but she kept the rifle steady. "I said state your business." "Easy now," Redbeard said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "We're just passing through. Thought we'd stop and see if Gideon needed anything from town. Didn't mean to startle you. Mr. Cross doesn't need anything. You can go." The scarred man laughed. Feisty. Conrad must have been blind and stupid to run from this one. "Or maybe he just had standards," the third man muttered, which made the other 2 snicker. Something hot and sharp twisted in Evelyn's chest. She'd heard comments like that her entire life, but hearing it up here, in the one place where she'd started to feel like maybe she was worth something, made rage boil up from somewhere deep. "Get off this property," she said, each word clipped and cold. Redbeard's amusement faded. "Look, sweetheart, we don't want trouble. We're friends of Gideon's. Bullshit." The word came out before Evelyn could stop it, and all 3 men stared at her in surprise. She didn't care. Something had snapped inside her, and she was done being polite to men who thought her existence was a joke. If you were friends, you'd know he doesn't welcome visitors without warning, and if you knew him at all, you'd know insulting someone under his roof is a good way to leave bleeding. She cocked the rifle deliberately. "So I'm going to count to 3, and if you're not on those horses by the time I'm done, I'm going to put a hole in your friend's leg and let him explain to Mr. Cross why he's bleeding on the porch." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Redbeard laughed, but it was nervous now. All right, we're going. No need to get excited." They mounted up quickly, the scarred man still smirking but also keeping his distance. As they turned their horses toward the trail, Redbeard looked back at her one more time. "Tell Gideon that Fletcher sends his regards," he said, "and that we'll be seeing him in town real soon." Then they were gone, disappearing back into the trees as quickly as they'd appeared. Evelyn stood on that porch with the rifle in her hands for another 5 minutes, adrenaline making her entire body shake. When she finally lowered the weapon, her legs almost gave out. She stumbled back inside and sat down hard on the bench near the door. What the hell had she just done? Those men could have killed her. They could have done worse. She'd stood there threatening them with a rifle she barely knew how to use, all because they'd insulted her and she'd been too angry to be smart about it. She was still sitting there, trying to calm her racing heart, when Gideon returned an hour later. He took one look at her face and immediately went still. What happened? Evelyn told him everything. The 3 riders, the insults, the threats she'd made with his rifle. As she talked, she watched Gideon's expression shift from concern to something darker and more dangerous. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Did they touch you?" His voice was quiet, but there was something sharp underneath it. "No, they left after I threatened to shoot them." "And the one with the red beard said his name was Fletcher?" "Yes. He said to tell you he'd see you in town soon." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Fletcher's a trader who runs whiskey and furs up to the mining camps. Not a friend. More like a problem I keep having to remind to stay off my land." He looked at her directly. "You did the right thing. You held your ground, and you didn't let them push you. That's exactly what you should have done." "I thought maybe I should have just stayed inside. Then they would have known you were scared, would have come back." Gideon set down his pack and moved to the stove to make coffee. "You showed them you'd fight. That matters up here. Reputation is the only thing that keeps predators away, animal or human." Evelyn watched him move around the cabin with that same economical efficiency he brought to everything. "Why do men like that come up here?" "Same reason anyone comes to the frontier, running from something or looking for something, usually both." He poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. "Territory's changing. Used to be just trappers and indigenous tribes. Now it's ranchers and miners and railroad men, all fighting over the same land. Men like Fletcher see opportunity in the chaos. And you?" "Me?" Gideon sat down across from her. "I came here to disappear." It was the most personal thing he'd said since she'd arrived. Evelyn wanted to ask more about his wife, his daughter, the life he'd lost. But something in his expression warned her off. So instead, she asked a different question. "Do you think they'll come back?" "Not here, but I'll see them in town eventually, and we'll have words." He took a sip of coffee. "In the meantime, you need to get better with that rifle. Not just comfortable, better." Over the next week, Gideon worked with Evelyn every evening until she could hit a target at 50 yards consistently. He taught her how to reload quickly, how to shoot from different positions, how to stay calm when her heart was racing. He was patient but demanding, pushing her until her shoulder ached from the recoil and her hands cramped from gripping the stock. "Again," he'd say after each shot, and Evelyn would reload and try again. One evening, after she'd hit the same knothole in a dead tree 5 times in a row, Gideon finally nodded approval. "That's good enough to keep you alive," he said. "Keep practicing, and it'll be good enough to scare people." Evelyn lowered the rifle and looked at him. "Why does it matter if I scare people?" "Because scared people don't attack, they calculate, they think twice." He started gathering the empty cartridges. "Fear is a tool, same as anything else. You're a woman alone up here sometimes. You can't rely on strength, but you can rely on making someone believe you're dangerous enough that hurting you isn't worth the risk." It was a brutal philosophy, but Evelyn was starting to understand that the mountains required brutal honesty. There was no room for pretending things were softer than they were. As they walked back to the cabin in the fading light, Gideon spoke again. "You handled Fletcher better than most men would have. Stood your ground without escalating into violence. That takes more guts than pulling a trigger." Evelyn glanced at him sideways. "Are you saying I did well?" "I'm saying you're learning." It wasn't quite a compliment, but coming from Gideon Cross, it felt like one. That night, for the first time since arriving, Evelyn slept without nightmares about Red Hollow or Conrad Whitmore. The mountains were still brutal. The work was still endless, but she was becoming someone who could survive them. And that was worth more than any marriage proposal ever had been. April arrived with false spring, warm days that melted snow followed by freezing nights that turned everything to ice. The cattle started moving to higher pastures, which meant Gideon spent longer days checking on the herds and repairing winter damage to fences. Sometimes he'd be gone from dawn until well after dark, leaving Evelyn alone with the chickens, the garden she was trying to start, and her own thoughts. The solitude didn't bother her anymore. In fact, she was starting to prefer it. There was something peaceful about working without someone watching, without someone judging, without someone expecting her to be anything other than capable. One afternoon while Gideon was out, Evelyn decided to tackle a project she'd been avoiding, organizing the root cellar. It was a mess of half-empty crates, spoiled vegetables, and mysterious containers Gideon had probably forgotten existed. She lit a lantern and climbed down the wooden ladder, determined to make sense of the chaos. 3 hours later, she'd sorted everything, thrown out what was rotten, and reorganized the remaining supplies so they were actually accessible. She was covered in dirt and cobwebs, but feeling accomplished when she found a small wooden box shoved into the far corner behind a barrel of salted pork. She almost left it alone. It clearly wasn't food storage, but curiosity got the better of her. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, all in the same feminine handwriting, all addressed to Gideon, and underneath the letters, a small daguerreotype photograph of a young woman holding a baby. Evelyn knew immediately she'd found something she wasn't supposed to see. The woman in the photograph was beautiful. Delicate features, dark hair, gentle eyes. The baby was maybe 6 months old, wrapped in a christening gown. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, Sarah and Elizabeth, June 1873, Gideon's wife and daughter. Evelyn's throat tightened. She carefully placed the photograph back in the box, closed the lid, and returned it exactly where she'd found it. Then she climbed out of the cellar and scrubbed her hands until they were raw, trying to wash away the feeling that she'd violated something sacred. When Gideon returned that evening, Evelyn didn't mention what she'd found. They ate dinner in their usual comfortable silence, and she helped him catalog which fences needed the most urgent repair. But later, lying in her bed and listening to the wind howl outside, she couldn't stop thinking about that photograph. Sarah had been beautiful in a way Evelyn would never be. Delicate, refined. The kind of woman who probably knew how to arrange flowers and host dinner parties and make a home feel elegant instead of just functional. Everything Evelyn wasn't. And suddenly she understood something painful. Gideon had loved a woman who was her opposite in every way. When he looked at Evelyn, he wasn't seeing someone he could love. He was seeing someone who could work, someone useful, someone practical. It shouldn't have hurt, but it did. Over the next few days, Evelyn found herself watching Gideon differently, noticing the way he moved through the cabin like he was constantly aware of empty spaces where people used to be. The way he'd sometimes stop mid-task and stare out the window at nothing. The way he never, ever talked about his past unless forced to. He was haunted, and Evelyn was just a temporary distraction from his ghosts. One evening, while they were working together to repair a broken wagon wheel, Evelyn finally broke the careful silence they'd maintained. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. Gideon looked up from the axle he was examining. "Leaving where?" "Here. The mountains. This cabin." She gestured at the wilderness around them. "Do you ever think about going somewhere less isolated?" He was quiet for a long moment. "No." "Why not?" "Because the only thing worse than being alone is being alone in a crowd." He returned his attention to the axle. "At least up here, the isolation is honest. Nobody pretends to care when they don't." Evelyn understood that sentiment more than she wanted to admit. "Is that why you came up here after they died?" Gideon's hand stilled on the wood. She'd crossed a line, and they both knew it. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have—" "It's all right." He set down the tools and straightened up. "You want to know why I stay? Fair enough." He looked out at the mountains rising in the distance. "I came up here because after Sarah and Elizabeth died, I couldn't stand people offering me sympathy I didn't want, and solutions I didn't ask for. Everyone had advice. Everyone knew what I should do, how I should grieve, when I should move on." His voice went hard. "Nobody asked what I needed, so I left." "And what did you need?" "To be left alone with it, to not have to pretend I was healing when I wasn't." He picked up the tools again. "Still don't, if I'm honest, but at least up here nobody expects me to." Evelyn felt something crack open inside her chest. She'd spent her whole life trying to be what other people expected, and it had gotten her nothing but disappointment and abandonment. Gideon had walked away from expectations entirely and built a life where nobody could judge him for failing to meet them. "I found the photograph," she said quietly, "in the root cellar. I wasn't snooping, I was organizing, and I know," Gideon interrupted. "I wondered when you'd find it. Been meaning to move that box somewhere less obvious." "She was beautiful." "Yes." "I'm sorry you lost them." Gideon looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. "Me too, but Sarah and Elizabeth have been gone 10 years, and you're standing here now. That matters more than you think." Evelyn didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and went back to helping him with the wagon wheel, and they worked in silence until the sun set and the temperature dropped and they both went inside to escape the cold. But something had changed between them. Some invisible wall had cracked, and Evelyn wasn't sure if that was dangerous or just inevitable. May brought warmer weather and harder work. The cattle needed to be moved to summer pastures, which meant days of riding through rough terrain, checking on the herds, and making sure predators hadn't taken too many calves. Gideon taught Evelyn how to ride properly. Not the side-saddle nonsense society demanded, but actually ride, with confidence and control. You need to be able to move fast if something goes wrong, he explained as she struggled to stay mounted on a particularly stubborn mare. Riding like a lady will get you killed out here. So Evelyn learned to ride like a rancher. She learned to rope calves, treat injuries, read weather patterns, and navigate by landmarks instead of roads. She learned which plants were medicinal and which were poison. She learned how to track animals through mud and identify predator kills from natural death. She was becoming someone she barely recognized. One afternoon, while they were moving cattle through a narrow canyon, a young bull decided to challenge Gideon's authority. The animal lowered its head and charged, and for a terrifying moment, Evelyn thought she was about to watch Gideon get gored. But Gideon didn't panic. He simply stood his ground, raised his arms to make himself look larger, and shouted at the bull with a voice that could have cracked stone. The animal skidded to a stop 10 feet away, snorted once, and backed down. "You have to show them you're not afraid," Gideon said afterward, like he hadn't just stared down 1,200 pounds of angry beef. "Even when you are." "Were you afraid?" Evelyn asked. "Terrified. But the bull didn't need to know that." They made camp that night in a clearing near a stream, too far from the cabin to make it back before dark. Gideon built a fire while Evelyn prepared their supplies. They ate in companionable silence, listening to the cattle settle and the forest come alive with night sounds. "You're different than when you arrived," Gideon said suddenly. Evelyn looked up from the coffee she was nursing. "Different how?" "Stronger, not just physically, harder to shake." He poked the fire with a stick. "That first day, you looked like a strong wind would knock you over. Now you look like you'd fight the wind and win." "I had good teachers," she paused. "Mostly you." "I didn't teach you strength, just showed you how to use what you already had." He met her eyes across the fire. "You should know that. You were always strong. You just didn't realize it." Something warm spread through Evelyn's chest that had nothing to do with the fire or the coffee. For the first time in her life, someone saw her as strong instead of stubborn, capable instead of difficult, worthy instead of unfortunate. "Thank you," she said quietly. Gideon just nodded and returned his attention to the fire. They slept on opposite sides of the flames that night, wrapped in bedrolls under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had torn holes in the darkness. Evelyn lay awake for a long time, listening to Gideon's steady breathing and the distant sounds of cattle and forest, and realized something that should have terrified her. She didn't want to leave the mountains anymore. She'd stopped thinking about earning enough money to move on, stopped imagining a different life somewhere easier and more civilized. The brutal isolation she'd once feared had become the only place where she felt like herself. And Gideon, the dangerous, haunted rancher who'd offered her a job instead of pity, had become the only person she trusted completely. That realization kept her awake until dawn. They returned to the cabin 3 days later, both exhausted and covered in trail dust. Evelyn went straight to the well to wash while Gideon tended the horses. She was scrubbing dirt from her arms when she heard riders approaching. Her stomach dropped. Not again. But when the riders came into view, they weren't Fletcher and his friends. It was a single rider, a young man on a tired-looking horse, carrying saddlebags that marked him as a supply courier. Gideon emerged from the barn as the courier dismounted. "Afternoon," the young man said. "Got a delivery for Miss Evelyn Mercer. Was told I'd find her here." Evelyn's heart stopped. Nobody knew she was here. Nobody except... "Who sent it?" Gideon asked, his voice gone cold. The courier checked his log. "Says here it's from a Mr. Conrad Whitmore, Denver. Paid extra to make sure it got here personal." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Evelyn walked toward them on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. "That's me," she said. "I'm Evelyn Mercer." The courier handed her a sealed envelope and a small package. "He asked me to wait for a reply if you've got one." Evelyn stared at the envelope like it might bite her. Conrad Whitmore. The man who'd abandoned her before they'd even met. The man whose cruelty had driven her into these mountains in the first place. What could he possibly want now? No reply, she said. The courier shrugged. Suit yourself. Have a good day, ma'am. He rode off, leaving Evelyn standing there with Conrad's letter in her hands, and Gideon watching her with an expression she couldn't read. You going to open it? He asked. I don't know. Want me to burn it? Part of her wanted to say yes, but another part, the part that had survived abandonment and humiliation and months of brutal mountain survival, wanted to know what Conrad Whitmore thought he could possibly say that would matter now. She opened the envelope. The letter was written on expensive paper in elegant script, and every word felt like a knife. Dear Miss Mercer, I know I have no right to contact you after the way I behaved. My actions were inexcusable, and I've regretted them every day since. I was a coward and a fool. I've recently come into considerable fortune through a mining investment in Colorado. I've purchased property in Denver and established myself in society here. I'm writing to extend an offer I should have extended months ago, a marriage proposal. I can give you the life you deserve, comfort, security, and respect. I've enclosed train tickets and sufficient funds for travel. If you're willing to give me a second chance, I promise I will spend the rest of my life making up for the pain I caused you. The tickets are good for 3 months. I hope you'll consider my offer. Yours in deep regret, Conrad Whitmore. Inside the package were 2 train tickets to Denver and $200 in cash. Evelyn read the letter twice, trying to process what she was seeing. Conrad Whitmore, the man who'd humiliated her, who'd fled rather than face her, who'd left her stranded and penniless in a hostile town, was now offering her everything she'd originally come west to find. Money, security, social standing, everything she'd once wanted. She looked up to find Gideon watching her carefully. What does he want? Gideon asked. To marry me. Her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. He's rich now. Says he wants to make things right. Gideon's expression went completely blank. I see. $200. Train tickets to Denver. A promise of the life I thought I was getting when I came west. That's generous. Yes. They stood there in silence, the unasked question hanging between them like smoke. Finally, Gideon spoke. You should go. Evelyn stared at him. What? You should take his offer. $200 is more than I could pay you in 2 years, and he can give you things I never could. Safety, comfort, a real future. Gideon's voice was carefully neutral. You deserve that. Something sharp twisted in Evelyn's chest. You want me to leave? I want you to have options. When you came here, you didn't have any. Now you do. He looked away, toward the mountains. I won't hold you here out of obligation or convenience. Evelyn felt like she'd been punched. Here was Gideon Cross, the man who'd ridden through a snowstorm to give her a choice when nobody else would, now telling her to choose someone else. To take the easy way. To leave. And what if I don't want to go? She asked. Then you're a fool. But his voice cracked slightly on the word. Conrad's offering you everything, Evelyn. Don't throw that away because you're comfortable here. Comfortable? She laughed, but it came out bitter. You think I'm comfortable? I work 15-hour days. I haven't had a full night's sleep in weeks. I've got calluses on my calluses, and I can barely remember what it feels like to wear a dress that isn't covered in mud or blood. She stepped closer. But I'm also happier than I've ever been. I'm stronger. I'm capable. I matter here. Not because someone's marrying me out of pity or obligation, but because I earn it every single day. Gideon finally looked at her, and there was something raw in his eyes. You matter here. Then why are you trying to get rid of me? Because you deserve more than this. The words burst out of him like they'd been locked away too long. You deserve more than isolation and hard work and a life where your biggest accomplishment is surviving another winter. Conrad's offering you civilization, society, everything you left Philadelphia to find. I left Philadelphia because I was drowning there. Evelyn's voice shook. And I came west looking for rescue. But I don't need rescuing anymore, Gideon. The mountains broke me open and put me back together as someone who doesn't need saving. Then what do you need? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with everything they'd both been avoiding for months. I need to decide for myself, Evelyn said finally. Not because Conrad wants me. Not because you don't. Because I choose it. She walked past him into the cabin, Conrad's letter still clutched in her hand, and closed the door behind her. Outside, Gideon stood alone in the fading light, looking at the mountains that had been his refuge for 10 years, and wondered if he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. For 3 days, neither of them mentioned the letter. Evelyn went about her work with mechanical precision, feeding chickens, hauling water, tending the garden, while Conrad's envelope sat on the small table beside her bed like an accusation. She'd wake up and see it first thing every morning. She'd fall asleep staring at it every night. $200 and a one-way ticket to the life she'd thought she wanted. Gideon retreated into silence. He left before dawn and returned after dark, always finding some fence that needed repair or some cattle that needed checking. When they were forced to occupy the same space, he was unfailingly polite and completely distant. He'd become a stranger again, and Evelyn hated it. On the 4th morning, she woke to find him gone and a note on the kitchen table. Writing to North Pasture, back in 3 days. Supplies in the cellar if you need them. 3 days alone. 3 days to sit with Conrad's offer and her own confusion and the awful silence that had settled over the cabin like a shroud. Evelyn crumpled the note and threw it into the stove. Then she grabbed her coat and the rifle and walked out into the forest with no particular destination in mind. She just needed to move, to think, to escape the 4 walls that suddenly felt like they were closing in. She walked for hours, following deer trails through the pine trees and trying to make sense of the mess inside her head. The practical part of her brain kept listing reasons to accept Conrad's offer. Financial security, social respectability, an easier life than the mountains could ever provide. She'd be stupid to turn down $200 and a marriage proposal from a wealthy man. But every time she tried to imagine herself in Denver, wearing fine dresses and attending society functions and being Conrad Whitmore's wife, her stomach twisted with something that felt like grief. Because that life meant leaving the mountains, leaving the cabin, leaving Gideon. And somewhere in the last few months, this brutal, isolated existence had stopped being temporary and started feeling like home. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the smoke. It was just a thin ribbon rising above the trees to the east, barely visible against the gray sky. For a moment, Evelyn thought it might be from the cabin, but no. The direction was wrong. This was coming from deeper in the forest, maybe 2 miles away. Every instinct told her to turn around and head back, but curiosity and something else, maybe recklessness, maybe the need to focus on something other than her own problems, pushed her forward. She found the source of the smoke 20 minutes later, a makeshift camp near a frozen creek. 3 men huddled around a fire, and even from a distance, Evelyn recognized one of them. Fletcher, the red-bearded trader who'd insulted her on the porch weeks ago. She should have turned around immediately. Should have gone back to the cabin and waited for Gideon to return. Should have done anything except what she actually did, which was move closer to see what they were doing on Gideon's land. She crept through this undergrowth as quietly as possible, staying downwind so they wouldn't catch her scent. The rifle felt heavy in her hands, but its weight was also reassuring. If things went wrong, at least she wasn't defenseless. "Telling you, Cross won't even notice," Fletcher was saying. "He's got too much land to patrol it all. We take 20 head from the east pasture, drive them through the canyon to Miller's place, and we're clear before he even realizes they're missing." Evelyn's blood went cold. They were planning to steal Gideon's cattle. The scarred man from her first encounter laughed. "And if he does notice? Then we deal with him the same way we dealt with Henderson last year. Man had an unfortunate accident with his barn, real tragedy." Fletcher spat into the fire. "Cross thinks his reputation keeps him safe up here. Time someone reminded him that reputation don't mean shit when your house is burning." The third man, someone Evelyn hadn't seen before, looked nervous. "I don't know, Fletcher. Burning a man's home is different than stealing cattle. That's survival," Fletcher interrupted. "Cross controls too much good grazing land. He don't use half of it, just keeps it empty because he likes the isolation. Well, some of us got businesses to run, and if he won't sell or share, then we take what we need." "When?" the scarred man asked. "Tonight. Cross is gone checking his north herds. Saw him ride out this morning. That woman of his can't stop us. Hell, might even teach her some manners while we're at it." Fletcher grinned in a way that made Evelyn's skin crawl. "Conrad Whitmore was a fool for running. I wouldn't mind showing her what a real man." Evelyn didn't wait to hear the rest. She backed away slowly, carefully, until she was far enough that she could move quickly without being heard. Then she ran. She ran through the forest like wolves were chasing her, branches whipping at her face and her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her mind raced faster than her feet. Gideon was 3 days away. She had no way to reach him, no way to warn him, and Fletcher and his men were planning to burn the cabin and steal cattle tonight. She could run, take Conrad's money and the train tickets and disappear before Fletcher ever reached the cabin. It was the smart choice, the safe choice. But the thought lasted maybe 3 seconds before Evelyn rejected it completely. This was her home now. Gideon had given her a place when nobody else would. He taught her to be strong, to be capable, to be worth something. And she'd be damned if she let Fletcher and his friends destroy that out of greed and spite. She reached the cabin as the sun was starting to set. Her lungs burned and her legs shook, but her mind was clear. She had maybe 3 hours before Fletcher arrived. 3 hours to prepare for a fight she had no business fighting. But Gideon had taught her well, and he'd said fear was a tool. Time to make Fletcher afraid. Evelyn moved through the cabin with purpose, gathering everything she'd need. Extra ammunition for the rifle. The revolver Gideon kept in his bedroom, every lantern and lamp oil she could find, rope, matches, the hunting knife she used for butchering chickens. She loaded both guns and positioned them strategically, rifle by the front door, revolver near the back window. She lit only one small lamp inside and made sure all the curtains were closed so Fletcher wouldn't be able to see her moving around. Then she took 3 lanterns and carried them outside. Gideon had taught her about creating defensible positions, about using terrain and surprise to offset superior numbers, about making your enemy think twice before engaging. She was about to put all those lessons to use. She positioned the first lantern on the porch steps, clearly visible from the trail. The second she hung from a tree branch about 30 yards from the cabin, creating a perimeter of light. The third she placed near the barn. Then she walked the property line, looking for the most likely approach routes and the best places to make a stand. The horse corral was on the east side, backed by thick forest. That's where they'd come from, close enough to the trees for cover, but with a clear path to the barn and cabin. Evelyn positioned herself behind a fallen log that gave her a sight line to both the corral and the cabin doors. From here, she could see anyone approaching without being easily spotted. Then she waited. The temperature dropped as night fell, and Evelyn's breath came out in white puffs. Her hands were steady on the rifle, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd never shot at a person before, never even pointed a gun at someone with the intention of pulling the trigger. The thought made her stomach turn. But the alternative was letting Fletcher burn her home and hurt her, and she'd already decided that wasn't going to happen. The first rider appeared just after full dark. Then 2 more, exactly as she'd expected. They dismounted at the tree line and moved toward the cabin on foot, trying to stay quiet. Fletcher was in front, the scarred man behind him, and the nervous third man bringing up the rear. Evelyn let them get within 20 yards of the cabin before she cocked the rifle. The sound cut through the night like a gunshot, and all 3 men froze. "That's far enough," Evelyn called out, keeping her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "Turn around and leave. Last warning." Fletcher laughed. Well, the mail-order bride thinks she's a gunfighter. Sweetheart, put down the rifle before you hurt yourself." "I'm not your sweetheart. And if you take one more step, I'll put a bullet in your leg and leave you to bleed while I go for the sheriff." "Sheriff's 3 days away," the scarred man said, "and you're alone. Alone and armed is better than 3 idiots about to get shot." Evelyn adjusted her aim slightly, centering on Fletcher's center mass. "I heard you in the forest today. Heard you planning to steal cattle and burn the cabin. That's rustling and arson. They hang men for less." Fletcher's expression darkened. "You were spying on us? You were on private property discussing felonies. I call that evidence." She kept the rifle steady. "Now you've got 2 choices. Turn around and leave, or see if I'm bluffing about pulling this trigger." For a long moment, nobody moved. Evelyn could feel sweat running down her back despite the cold. Her arms were starting to ache from holding the rifle steady, but she didn't dare lower it. Then Fletcher smiled, and Evelyn knew he'd decided to call her bluff. "Boys," he said quietly, "spread out. She can't shoot all 3 of us." They started to move, and Evelyn made a decision. She aimed at Fletcher's feet and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the night like thunder. Dirt and rocks exploded 6 inches from Fletcher's boots, and he jumped back with a startled curse. The other two men dove for cover. "Next one goes in your knee," Evelyn said, already reloading. Her hands were shaking now, but her voice stayed cold. "You really want to test whether I'm a good enough shot?" Fletcher had gone pale. "You crazy bitch. You could have killed me. If I wanted you dead, you'd be dead. I'm giving you a chance to leave. Don't waste it." The scarred man was already backing toward the horses. "Fletcher, she's serious. Let's go." But Fletcher's pride was wounded, and wounded pride made men stupid. "Like hell. 3 of us. 1 of her. We rush her together. She can't—" The second shot cut him off. This one hit a tree branch directly above his head, showering him with bark and pine needles. "Oops," Evelyn said. "Hand slipped. Third shot's going somewhere more permanent." That finally did it. Fletcher raised his hands slowly and started backing up. "This ain't over. Cross comes back. We're going to have words about this." "Good. I'll tell him myself about your plans to burn his home and steal his cattle. I'm sure he'll be very interested in having words." Evelyn kept the rifle trained on them as they retreated to their horses. "And Fletcher, if I see you on this property again, I won't fire warning shots." They mounted up and rode off, Fletcher cursing the whole way. Evelyn stayed behind the log for another 10 minutes, making sure they were really gone and not just regrouping. When she was finally satisfied, she lowered the rifle and let herself shake. She'd done it. She'd faced down 3 armed men and sent them running, alone. The realization hit her like a physical force. She'd spent her entire life being told she was weak, useless, worth nothing. And tonight she'd proven every one of those voices wrong. She walked back to the cabin on trembling legs, secured all the doors and windows, and then sat down at the kitchen table with the rifle across her lap. She wouldn't sleep tonight. Couldn't risk Fletcher coming back. So she made coffee and sat vigil, watching the darkness outside and replaying every moment of the confrontation. Somewhere around midnight, she started laughing. It bubbled up from somewhere deep inside, wild, slightly hysterical laughter that she couldn't quite control. She'd threatened to shoot a man. She'd fired warning shots. She'd sent armed rustlers running like scared rabbits. And it felt amazing. When Gideon returned 3 days later, Evelyn was in the garden trying to coax early lettuce out of the still cold ground. She heard his horse and stood up, wiping dirt from her hands. He looked exhausted, like he'd been pushing hard to get back. "Everything all right?" he asked, dismounting quickly. His eyes scanned the property, looking for signs of trouble. "Fine. Well, mostly fine." Evelyn walked over to him. "Fletcher came by while you were gone." Gideon went very still. "He touch you?" "No. He tried to intimidate me. I shot at him instead." For a moment, Gideon just stared at her. Then slowly, something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You shot at Fletcher?" "Twice. Warning shots." Evelyn crossed her arms. "He was planning to steal your cattle and burn the cabin. I overheard them in the forest. When they showed up, I encouraged them to reconsider. With gunfire. With gunfire." Gideon actually laughed. A real laugh, deep and genuine. It transformed his entire face, erasing years of grief and hardness. "I would have paid money to see Fletcher's face. He called me a crazy bitch. High compliment from Fletcher. Means he's scared of you." Gideon looked at her with something new in his eyes. Pride, maybe. Or respect. "You did good, Evelyn. Better than good. You protected this place like it was yours." "It feels like mine," she said quietly. "That's the problem." The smile faded from Gideon's face. "Conrad's offer." "Yeah." They stood there in uncomfortable silence, all the warmth from moments ago evaporating. Finally, Gideon cleared his throat. "Have you decided?" "I don't know." Evelyn looked away, toward the mountains rising in the distance. "Conrad's offering me everything I thought I wanted. But standing there with that rifle, facing down those men, I realized something. I'm not the same person who came here. That woman wanted rescue, wanted someone to take care of her, wanted to disappear into someone else's life because her own wasn't worth living. And now I've got a life worth fighting for. Even if it's brutal and isolated and half the territory thinks I'm crazy." She turned back to him. "But I don't know if that life includes me staying here. You made it pretty clear you think I should leave." Gideon flinched like she'd slapped him. "I said you should have options. That's different than wanting you gone." "Is it?" The question came out sharper than she intended. Because it felt a lot like you couldn't wait to ship me off to Denver the second Conrad threw money at the problem. Because you deserve better than this. Gideon's voice rose, and Evelyn realized it was the first time she'd ever heard him yell. You deserve a man who can give you a real life, nice house, social standing, a future that doesn't involve working yourself to death just to survive winter. I can't give you any of that, Evelyn. All I've got is hard work, isolation, and a cabin full of ghosts. Conrad can give you everything. Why the hell wouldn't you take it? Because Conrad doesn't see me. The words burst out of Evelyn before she could stop them. He sees a photograph. A mail-order bride who'll look good on his arm and be grateful enough that she won't ask questions. He's not offering me a life. He's offering me a role to play in his life. She stepped closer to Gideon. You see me. The real me. The one who burns breakfast and shoots at rustlers and has dirt under her fingernails from working in the garden. You don't expect me to be anything other than what I am. Why would I trade that for all the money in Denver? Gideon looked at her like she'd just spoken a foreign language. You're saying you want to stay. I'm saying I don't want to leave. That's not quite the same thing. Evelyn took a shaky breath. But I need to know something first. Why did you really tell me to take Conrad's offer? Because you think I'll be happier with him, or because you don't want me here? The silence stretched out so long that Evelyn thought he wasn't going to answer. Then Gideon ran a hand through his hair and let out a long breath. 10 years ago, Sarah got sick, he said quietly. Started with a fever. Within a week, she couldn't get out of bed. I rode for the doctor, but the storm was so bad it took me 3 days to reach town and 3 more to get back. By the time we returned, Elizabeth had it too. His voice went rough. They died within hours of each other, and I wasn't there. I was out in a snowstorm trying to find help, and they died alone. Evelyn's throat tightened. Gideon, I came up here to die too, he continued. Not quickly, just slowly. Work until I couldn't anymore, then let the winter take me. But that didn't happen. I kept surviving, kept going. And after a while, the isolation stopped being punishment and started being comfortable, safe. Nobody could leave me if I never let anyone close. And then I showed up. And then you showed up. Gideon finally met her eyes. And you were supposed to be temporary. A job. Someone who'd stay a few months and move on and not matter. He shook his head. But you fought for this place like it was yours. You learned everything I taught you and pushed for more. You stood on that porch and faced down Fletcher like you were born to it. And somewhere in all of that, you stopped being temporary and started being... He cut himself off. Started being what? Important. The word came out rough. You became important, and I told you to take Conrad's offer because I'm terrified. Because everyone I let matter and ends up leaving or dying, and I can't survive losing someone else. So I thought if I pushed you away first, maybe it wouldn't hurt as much when you left. Evelyn felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Gideon let out a surprised laugh. Probably. I'm not Sarah. I'm not going to die from fever, and I'm not going anywhere unless you actually want me gone. She stepped close enough that she could see the silver in his dark beard, the lines around his eyes. But I need you to say it, out loud. Do you want me to stay, or do you want me to take Conrad's money and go to Denver? For a long moment, Gideon just looked at her. Then he reached out slowly, like she might bolt, and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses and scarred from years of hard work, and it felt exactly right. I want you to stay, he said. More than I've wanted anything in 10 years. But I'm broken, Evelyn. I'm not good at this. I'll probably mess it up. Good. I'm broken too. We'll mess it up together. She squeezed his hand. But I'm staying. Not because of you, or despite you, or for you. I'm staying because this is where I belong. Something in Gideon's expression cracked open. He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her like he was afraid she'd disappear if he let go. Evelyn buried her face in his chest and felt his heart hammering against her cheek. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the middle of the clearing while the wind moved through the pine trees and the mountains watched indifferently. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't perfect. Evelyn's back hurt from gardening, and Gideon smelled like horses and sweat from 3 days on the trail. But it was real. And real was better than anything Conrad's money could buy. That evening, Evelyn took Conrad's letter and the train tickets out to the burn pile behind the cabin. She stood there for a moment, looking at them one last time. $200. A wealthy husband, an easier life. Then she struck a match and watched them burn. The next morning, she woke to find Gideon standing in the kitchen making breakfast. Real breakfast, not just coffee and bread. Eggs, bacon, and even something that might have been pancakes if she squinted. "What's this?" she asked, still half asleep. "Figured if you're staying, we should celebrate." He looked almost embarrassed. "I'm not great at cooking, but it's perfect." Evelyn sat down at the table. "Though, you know I'm not expecting you to cook for me, right? This isn't some traditional arrangement where I play housewife." "Thank God, I've seen you cook. I'd starve." He brought over 2 plates. "I was thinking we could be partners. Split the work, share the decisions. You run the household, I run the cattle. We both do what needs doing." "Partners," Evelyn repeated, testing the word. "I like that." They ate in comfortable silence, and afterward Gideon pulled out a map of the property. "If you're serious about staying, there's things you need to know. Legal things. This land is in my name, but if something happens to me, I want to make sure you're protected. Nothing's going to happen to you. Probably not, but probably isn't good enough." He pointed to various sections of the map. "I own 800 acres outright, lease another 400 from the territory. The cattle are registered under Cross Ranch, and the brands are filed in Red Hollow. I've got accounts with the bank in town and with suppliers in Denver. If I die or get seriously injured, you need to know how to access everything." Evelyn felt something tight in her chest. "You're really thinking about this. I've been alone too long, made me careless about what happens after. But if you're here, that changes things." He looked at her seriously. "I want you to inherit everything. The land, the cattle, the accounts. All of it. That means we need to get married." The word hung in the air between them. "Married," Evelyn said slowly, "like legally married, not just partnership." "Yes." Gideon set down the map. "I know this isn't romantic. I know I'm not Conrad with his fancy proposals and train tickets, but I'm offering you something real. This ranch, this life, everything I've built, as your husband, not your employer." Evelyn's heart was doing complicated things in her chest. This wasn't the proposal she'd imagined back in Philadelphia. No flowers, no pretty speeches, no going down on one knee. Just a scarred rancher with a map and a practical plan to protect her future. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever offered her. "Yes," she said. Gideon blinked. "Yes?" "Yes, I'll marry you, for legal reasons and protection and all those practical things you listed." She stood up and walked around the table to where he was sitting. "And also because I want to. Because I love you, even though you're terrible at saying what you feel, and you'll probably drive me crazy. And because I'd rather build a life with you in these brutal mountains than have an easy life with anyone else anywhere else." Gideon stood slowly, like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "You love me?" "Unfortunately, yes." "That's unfortunate?" "Completely. You're emotionally unavailable, you smell like cattle more often than not, and your idea of romance is a property map." Evelyn grinned. "But you're also the first person who ever saw me as strong instead of difficult, who treated me like I mattered, who gave me a choice when everyone else just gave me orders. So yeah, I love you. Deal with it." Gideon pulled her close and kissed her. Nothing fancy, just a rough, honest kiss that tasted like coffee and promises. When they broke apart, he was smiling, really smiling, not the ghost of one she'd seen before. "We'll go to town next week," he said. "Get the papers filed. Make it legal. And then we survive another winter together, and another, and we build something that lasts." He cupped her face in his rough hands. "I can't promise it'll be easy, but I can promise I'll never abandon you, never make you feel like you're not enough, never make you question your worth." "That's all I need," Evelyn said. They spent the rest of the day working side by side, repairing the chicken coop, checking fence lines, planning improvements to the cabin. It was ordinary work, the kind they'd done together dozens of times before, but now it felt different. Now they were building something together, not just surviving. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Evelyn stood on the porch and looked out at the land that was about to become hers. Legally, officially hers. Not because some man had offered it as charity, but because she'd earned it through months of brutal work and because Gideon trusted her enough to share it. "What are you thinking?" Gideon asked, coming up beside her. "That Conrad Whitmore is probably sitting in Denver right now, wondering why I haven't responded to his letter." Evelyn leaned against the porch railing. "Part of me wants to write him back. Tell him I chose differently." "You don't owe him an explanation." "I know, but I kind of want him to know anyway. Want him to know that the woman he abandoned became someone strong enough that she didn't need his rescue after all." Gideon considered this. "Then write him. Tell him you're staying. Tell him you're getting married to a mountain rancher who appreciates what he was too blind to see." He paused. "Just don't mention my name. Last thing I need is Conrad showing up here to cause problems." "Fair enough," Evelyn smiled. "Though I think you could take Conrad in a fight." "Probably, but I'd rather not test it." They went inside as the temperature dropped, and Evelyn sat down at the table with paper and pen. She wrote quickly, not overthinking it. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for your generous offer. I've decided to remain in the Wyoming Territory. I found work and companionship here that suits me better than Denver ever could. I wish you well in your future endeavors. Sincerely, Evelyn Mercer Short, polite, final." She didn't owe him more than that. She folded the letter and set it aside to mail next time they went to town. Then she joined Gideon by the fire, and they sat in comfortable silence while the wind howled outside and the cabin stayed warm and safe around them. Tomorrow they'd ride to Red Hollow and file the paperwork. They'd face whatever gossip or judgment the town wanted to throw at them. But tonight, they were just two broken people who'd found something worth keeping in each other. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The ride down to Red Hollow took most of the morning, and every mile closer to town made Evelyn's stomach tighten. She knew what was waiting for them. The stares, the whispers, the barely concealed judgment. The last time she'd been in Red Hollow, she'd been the abandoned mail-order bride everyone pitied or mocked. Now she was coming back as Gideon Cross's future wife, and that would bring its own complications. "You're quiet," Gideon said, guiding his horse alongside hers. "Just thinking about what people will say." "Does it matter?" "It shouldn't." Evelyn adjusted her grip on the reins. "But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous. Last time I was in town, I was a joke. Now I'm marrying you, which means I'm either a gold digger or a charity case, depending on who's doing the talking." Gideon was silent for a moment. "You know what Rose told me once? She said people in Red Hollow are like crows. They'll peck at anything shiny or different until they get bored and move on to the next thing. Best thing you can do is stop being interesting to them." "And how do I do that?" "By not caring what they think." He looked at her steadily. "You face down rustlers with a rifle, Evelyn. You can handle small-town gossip." She knew he was right, but knowing something and feeling it were two different things. They reached Red Hollow around noon. The town looked exactly the same: muddy streets, weathered buildings, people moving about their business with that particular frontier efficiency that came from living somewhere that could kill you if you weren't careful. But Evelyn felt different. The woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach 6 months ago had been soft, scared, and desperate. The woman riding into town now had calluses, confidence, and a loaded rifle strapped to her saddle. They hitched the horses outside the courthouse, a squat building that also served as the land office and the occasional jail when needed. Evelyn could feel eyes on them immediately, people pausing their conversations, turning to stare, whispering behind hands. "Let them look," Gideon said quietly, offering her his arm. Evelyn took it, and they walked into the courthouse together. The clerk was a thin man named Morrison, who looked like he'd been born wearing spectacles. He glanced up from his paperwork, saw Gideon, and immediately straightened. "Mr. Cross, didn't expect to see you in town for another few months." "Need to file some papers, Morrison. Marriage license and property transfer documents." Morrison's eyebrows shot up. "Marriage? You're getting married?" "That generally requires a license, yes." Of course. Morrison fumbled for the right forms. "And the bride's name?" "Evelyn Mercer," Evelyn said, stepping forward. "We met when I arrived in March." Recognition dawned on Morrison's face, followed by surprise, followed by the careful neutrality of someone trying very hard not to show what they were thinking. "Miss Mercer, yes, I remember. You were supposed to marry Conrad Whitmore." Plans changed, evidently. Morrison laid out several forms on the counter. I'll need information from both of you. Full names, dates of birth, current residence. For the property transfer, Mr. Cross, I'll need a full legal description of what you're conveying and to whom. They spent the next hour filling out paperwork while Morrison asked increasingly bureaucratic questions. Evelyn could hear people gathering outside the courthouse, their voices carrying through the thin walls. By the time they finished, half the town probably knew that Gideon Cross was marrying the abandoned mail-order bride. Everything's in order, Morrison said finally, stamping the documents with more force than necessary. The marriage license is good for 90 days. You'll need a minister or a justice to perform the ceremony. Judge Harwick still in town? Gideon asked. Leaves for the circuit tomorrow morning. If you want him to do it, you'll need to catch him today. Gideon looked at Evelyn. Today all right with you? She'd expected to have more time, expected to plan something, even if it was just deciding what to wear. But the look in Gideon's eyes told her he wanted this done, wanted her legally protected before anything else could go wrong. Today's fine, she said. They found Judge Harwick at the saloon, predictably, nursing a whiskey and playing cards with 3 other men. He was an older man with a magnificent white mustache and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many years reading legal documents in poor light. Gideon Cross, he said, not looking up from his cards. Haven't seen you in town since that business with the fence dispute. What brings you down from your mountain fortress? Need you to perform a marriage. That got the judge's attention. He set down his cards and looked at Gideon, then at Evelyn, then back at Gideon. You're getting married? To her? Her name is Evelyn Mercer, and yes, I'm marrying her. Today, if you're available. Judge Harwick studied Evelyn with the same careful attention he probably gave to difficult legal questions. She lifted her chin and met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away first. Well, he said finally, I'll be damned. Didn't think anyone would ever convince you to marry again. He stood up, leaving his cards and his whiskey. Let's do this properly then. You need witnesses? If you can provide them. The judge recruited 2 men from the saloon, neither of whom Evelyn recognized, and led them all to a small room behind the courthouse that apparently served as his chambers. It was cramped and smelled like old paper and tobacco, but it would do. You got a ring? The judge asked Gideon. No? Didn't think so. Most mountain folk don't bother. He pulled out a well-worn book of legal ceremonies. All right then, let's make this official. Both of you stand here. Witnesses over there. It wasn't a wedding Evelyn had ever imagined. No flowers, no music, no carefully chosen dress. She was wearing her riding clothes, still dusty from the trail. Gideon looked like he always did, rough, weathered, and utterly out of place in civilized society. The witnesses were complete strangers who kept exchanging glances like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. But when Judge Harwick started reading the ceremony, none of that mattered. We're gathered here to join Gideon Cross and Evelyn Mercer in matrimony. If anyone has objections, speak now or forever hold your peace. Silence. One of the witnesses coughed. Good enough. Gideon Cross, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Gideon looked at Evelyn, and something in his expression softened. I do. Evelyn Mercer, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Evelyn thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The humiliation in Red Hollow, the brutal mountain winter, the desperate fight to become someone worth something, and Gideon, always Gideon, seeing her when nobody else would. I do, she said. Then by the power vested in me by the Wyoming Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. Gideon, you may kiss your bride if you're so inclined. Gideon stepped closer and kissed her, brief, gentle, and completely genuine. The witnesses applauded awkwardly. Judge Harwick signed the certificate with a flourish and handed it to them. Congratulations. You're legally bound to each other for better or worse. Mostly worse, in my experience, but occasionally better. He shook Gideon's hand. Take care of her, Cross. She's got more spine than most men in this territory. I noticed, Gideon said. They left the courthouse as husband and wife, the certificate safely tucked in Evelyn's coat pocket. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, curious townspeople who wanted to see the mountain hermit and the abandoned bride who'd somehow ended up together. Rose was there, standing on the saloon porch with her arms crossed and a satisfied smirk on her face. She caught Evelyn's eye and nodded once, like she'd known this would happen all along. Evelyn nodded back, but not everyone in the crowd looked pleased. Fletcher stood near the feed store with his scarred companion, both of them watching with expressions that promised trouble. When Gideon saw them, his entire demeanor shifted, going cold and dangerous in a way that made several people step back. He walked straight toward Fletcher with Evelyn at his side. "Heard you paid my wife a visit while I was gone," Gideon said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "Heard you had plans to steal my cattle and burn my cabin." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "Don't know what you're talking about." "My wife does. She was there. Heard everything." Gideon stepped closer, using his size to intimidate without actually threatening. "She also fired warning shots when you showed up. Sent you running like a coward." A few people in the crowd snickered. Fletcher's face went red. "That crazy bitch could have killed me. If my wife wanted you dead, you'd be dead. She's a better shot than you deserve." Gideon's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "But here's what's going to happen now. You're going to stay off my land. You're going to stop talking about my wife. And you're going to remember that she's under my protection now, legally, officially, permanently. Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me. And everyone here knows what happens to people who disrespect me." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Fletcher looked like he wanted to argue, but the crowd was watching, and backing down in front of witnesses would be worse than taking the humiliation now. "Whatever," he muttered. "Your wife. Your problem." "My wife. My pride," Gideon corrected. "Remember that." He turned away, taking Evelyn's hand, and they walked back to the horses together. Behind them, Evelyn could hear the whispers starting, excited, shocked, impressed. Gideon Cross had just publicly claimed her as his wife and threatened anyone who'd dare insult her. It was the most dramatic wedding announcement Red Hollow had seen in years. They rode out of town an hour later, supplies loaded, marriage certificate filed, and their relationship now legally recognized by the territory. As Red Hollow disappeared behind them, Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That was intense," she said. "Fletcher needed to be put in his place. Everyone needed to know you're not alone anymore." Gideon glanced at her. "Does it bother you? The way I handled it?" "Are you kidding? That was the most romantic thing anyone's ever done for me." Gideon actually laughed. "Threatening a man in the middle of town is romantic? When you've spent your whole life being insulted and mocked, having someone publicly defend you feels pretty damn romantic, yes." Evelyn guided her horse closer to his. "Though I could have handled Fletcher myself if it came to it. I know. That's part of why I married you." They made camp that night halfway up the mountain trail, neither wanting to push the horses through the difficult terrain in darkness. Gideon built a fire while Evelyn unpacked their supplies, and they ate together under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. "My first wedding was different," Gideon said suddenly, staring into the flames. "Sarah's family wanted everything proper, church ceremony, reception, the whole performance. Took 6 months to plan." He poked the fire with a stick. "I hated every minute of it. Too many people, too many expectations. Felt like we were performing for an audience instead of making promises to each other." Evelyn waited, sensing he needed to say this. "Today was better," he continued. "Just us, making a choice. No performance, no pretending." He looked at her across the fire. "I know it wasn't fancy. I know I should have done something more. It was perfect," Evelyn interrupted. "I don't need fancy. I needed real, and today was real. Still, you deserved flowers at least. Maybe a ring. I don't need a ring to know you're committed. You literally just threatened a man in front of half the town for insulting me. That's more valuable than any piece of jewelry." She smiled. "Though if you want to make it up to me, you could teach me how to break horses." Gideon blinked. "Break horses? You've got 3 wild ones in the south pasture. I've seen them. I want to learn how to work with them." "That's dangerous. Horses can kill you if you don't know what you're doing. Good thing I've got an expert husband to teach me then." He shook his head, but he was smiling. "You're going to be the death of me, Evelyn Cross." Evelyn Cross. Her new name. It felt strange and right all at once. Get used to it, she said. You're stuck with me now. Legally bound, Gideon agreed, for better or worse. Mostly better, I think. Judge Harwick was too cynical. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn down to coals. When Evelyn finally unrolled her bedding, Gideon did something unexpected. He set his bedroll right next to hers instead of on the opposite side of the fire. "This all right?" he asked. "We're married, Gideon. Of course it's all right." He settled in beside her close enough that she could feel his warmth, but not so close that it felt presumptuous. It was typical Gideon, cautious with emotions, careful not to push too fast, even though they'd literally just promised to spend the rest of their lives together. "Thank you," Evelyn said quietly. "For what? For giving me a choice. For seeing me as worth something. For not treating today like a transaction." She turned to look at him in the dim firelight. For being the kind of man who'd ride into a snowstorm to offer a stranger a job instead of just letting her suffer. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand, threading his scarred fingers through hers. "I didn't save you," he said. "You saved yourself. I just gave you a place to do it. Then thank you for the place. Thank you for staying." They fell asleep like that, hands linked, the mountains dark and quiet around them. And for the first time in 10 years, Gideon Cross didn't dream about the family he'd lost. He dreamed about the future he was building. The next few weeks settled into a new rhythm. Evelyn still did most of the household work, but now Gideon helped more, splitting wood without being asked, carrying water when he saw her struggling, taking over dinner when she'd had a particularly hard day. And Evelyn pushed into his territory too, learning about cattle management and fence repair and the thousand small details that went into running a ranch. They were building a partnership, not just a marriage. But the mountains had a way of testing everything. Late June brought the first serious test. Gideon woke one morning complaining of a headache. By noon, he had a fever. By evening, he couldn't stand without help. Evelyn's first instinct was panic. She'd read about mountain fever, the illness that could sweep through settlements and kill half the population. She'd heard stories about men going to bed healthy and being dead by morning. But panic wouldn't help, so she forced herself to think practically. She got Gideon into bed, stripped him down to his undershirt, and started applying cold compresses to his forehead and neck. She made him drink water even when he complained it hurt to swallow. She tracked his temperature every few hours and watched for signs of things getting worse: rash, delirium, seizures. The fever peaked on the second day. Gideon was barely conscious, muttering about people and places Evelyn didn't recognize. Sometimes he called for Sarah. Once, he grabbed Evelyn's wrist with surprising strength and asked where Elizabeth was. "She's safe," Evelyn lied, because what else could she say? Rest now. But the fever wasn't breaking, and Evelyn was running out of ideas. Dr. Hale was in Red Hollow, 3 days away in good weather. The trail was treacherous even for experienced riders, and Evelyn had only been riding for a few months. She stood on the porch staring at Gideon's horse and made a decision she knew was probably insane. She was going for the doctor. She left Gideon with enough water and medicine to last, wrote a note in case he woke up confused, and saddled his horse, a big gelding named Prophet, who was faster and stronger than her usual mare. Then she loaded her rifle, packed supplies, and headed down the mountain at a pace that was just barely controlled. The ride was a nightmare. Evelyn pushed Prophet hard, stopping only when absolutely necessary. She navigated by landmarks Gideon had taught her, praying she wouldn't get lost or miss a turn. At night, she made cold camps, too afraid to build fires that might slow her down in the morning. Twice, wolves followed her through the forest. Once, Prophet stumbled on loose rocks and nearly threw her into a ravine. But Evelyn kept going, driven by the memory of Gideon's fever-bright eyes and the knowledge that she was the only thing standing between him and whatever Sarah and Elizabeth had died from. She reached Red Hollow on the evening of the third day, filthy and exhausted and barely able to stay in the saddle. She rode straight to Dr. Hale's house and pounded on his door until he answered. Mrs. Cross?" The doctor looked shocked to see her. "What's wrong?" "My husband. Fever. 3 days now. Won't break. Need you to come." The words came out choppy, her throat raw from days of cold air and dust. Dr. Hale grabbed his bag without asking questions. "I'll need my horse. Give me 5 minutes." While he prepared, Rose appeared from somewhere. Evelyn wasn't sure where. She pressed food into Evelyn's hands and made her eat while profit was being resupplied. "You rode down here alone?" Rose asked. "Had to." "That's either brave or stupid, possibly both." Rose gripped Evelyn's shoulder. "But you did it. Now get that doctor back up there and save your husband." The ride back was slower because Dr. Hale's horse couldn't match Profit's pace, but they still made good time. Evelyn pushed them as hard as she dared, terrified they'd arrive too late. Terrified she'd find Gideon the way he'd found Sarah and Elizabeth, already gone. They reached the cabin on the afternoon of the 6th day since Gideon had first fallen ill. Evelyn burst through the door to find him still in bed, still breathing but barely conscious. The fever had worsened in her absence, and she felt sick looking at him. Dr. Hale went to work immediately, checking vitals and asking questions Evelyn could barely answer. She hovered uselessly, watching the doctor work and praying to anyone who might be listening that she hadn't come this far just to lose him. "Mountain fever," Dr. Hale confirmed finally. "Bad case, but you got me here in time. Another day or two and—" He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. He mixed medicines, administered treatments, and gave Evelyn explicit instructions on care. Then he stayed for 2 days, monitoring Gideon's condition and making sure the fever was truly breaking. On the evening of the 2nd day, Gideon finally opened his eyes and focused on Evelyn. "You're here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Of course I'm here. Where else would I be?" "Thought I dreamed you. Thought you were Sarah." "No, I'm very much real, and very tired of watching you try to die on me." Evelyn grabbed his hand. "Don't do that again." "Noted." He closed his eyes, but he was smiling slightly. "How long?" 8 days total. You scared the hell out of me." "Sorry." "Don't apologize. Just don't get sick again." Dr. Hale left the next morning with payment and profound respect for Evelyn's determination. "Most women would have panicked and frozen," he told her. "You rode through dangerous territory alone to save him. That's not something I see often." "He would have done the same for me." "Yes, but you actually did it. That matters." After the doctor left, Evelyn sat beside Gideon's bed and let herself fall apart for the first time in over a week. She cried from exhaustion and relief and leftover terror. Cried because she'd come so close to losing the one person who'd ever made her feel like she mattered. Gideon pulled her down onto the bed beside him, still weak but strong enough for that, and held her while she cried. "I've got you," he whispered. "You're all right. We're both all right. You almost died, but I didn't, because you wouldn't let me." He pressed his face into her hair. "You crossed the mountains alone. You saved my life. You saved mine first. I was just returning the favor." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other, both too exhausted and grateful to do anything else. Outside, the mountains stood unchanged, brutal, indifferent, eternal. But inside the cabin, two people who'd been broken by life had somehow managed to put each other back together. And that was worth every hardship the frontier could throw at them. Gideon's recovery took weeks. Evelyn ran the ranch alone during that time, doing everything, tending cattle, maintaining fences, managing supplies. It was brutal work, and there were days she thought she'd collapse from exhaustion. But she kept going, driven by stubbornness and the knowledge that this was her ranch now too. Her responsibility. Her life. One afternoon in late July, she was trying to repair a broken water trough when a rider appeared on the trail. Not Fletcher this time, someone she didn't recognize. A well-dressed man on an expensive horse, looking completely out of place in the rugged mountain terrain. Evelyn grabbed her rifle and positioned herself where she could see him clearly. The man dismounted when he saw her. "Mrs. Cross? I'm looking for Evelyn Mercer." "I'm Evelyn Cross now. What do you want?" "My name is Theodore Jameson. I'm an attorney from Denver. I represent Conrad Whitmore." Evelyn's stomach dropped. Of course. Of course Conrad wouldn't just accept her rejection. Of course he'd send a lawyer. "Mr. Whitmore doesn't need an attorney to understand no," she said coldly. "I'm not here to convince you to reconsider, Mrs. Cross. I'm here to deliver documents." Jameson reached into his saddlebag slowly, keeping his movements visible. "Mr. Whitmore wanted me to ensure you received these personally." He handed her an envelope. Inside were legal documents, a property deed, and a banknote. "What is this?" Evelyn asked. "Mr. Whitmore felt terrible about abandoning you in Red Hollow. These documents transfer ownership of a small property in Denver to you, along with sufficient funds to maintain it. Consider it an apology and compensation for the distress he caused." Evelyn stared at the papers. The property was worth thousands. The bank note was for $500. It was more money than she'd see in 10 years of ranching. "I don't want his apology," she said. "Nevertheless, it's yours. The documents are legal and binding. The property and funds are in your name." Jameson tipped his hat. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to convey that he wishes you well in your marriage and hopes this gift will help secure your future." He rode away before Evelyn could argue further, leaving her standing there with a small fortune in her hands and absolutely no idea what to do with it. When Gideon was strong enough to sit up and listen, she showed him the documents. "Conrad sent these, property in Denver, and $500. His lawyer said it's an apology." Gideon studied the papers carefully. "He's trying to buy peace of mind, ease his guilt." "I don't want it. Feels wrong." "Why? You earned it. He put you through hell. This is the least he owes you." Gideon handed back the documents. "But it's your decision. Your property now, legally. You can accept it or send it back." Evelyn thought about it for a long time. Part of her wanted to reject everything Conrad offered out of pure spite. But another part, the practical part that had learned to survive in the mountains, recognized an opportunity. "If I keep it, we could use the money to improve the ranch, buy more cattle, maybe even hire help during calving season." "We could," Gideon agreed. "Or you could keep it as your own security, something that's just yours, separate from me and the ranch." "Why would I need security separate from you?" "Because you should always have options, always have a way out if you need one." He met her eyes seriously. "I love you, Evelyn, but I also respect you enough to want you to have choices. If this money gives you that, take it." It was the most Gideon thing he could have said, offering her freedom even within their marriage. In the end, Evelyn kept the property but put the money toward the ranch. It felt like the right balance, accepting Conrad's apology without letting it define her future. By August, Gideon was back to full strength, and the ranch settled into the rhythm of summer work. They expanded their herd, repaired buildings that had weathered poorly over winter, and started planning for the brutal cold they knew was coming. And somewhere in all of that work and planning and surviving together, Evelyn realized something profound. She was happy. Not the desperate, fragile happiness of someone who'd finally escaped suffering, but the deep, solid happiness of someone who'd built a life worth living. She was Evelyn Cross now, wife of a mountain rancher, owner of 800 acres of brutal frontier land, a woman who could shoot straight, ride hard, and face down rustlers without flinching. She'd come to Wyoming territory looking for rescue. Instead, she'd rescued herself. And that made all the difference. September arrived with the first hints of the winter that would define everything. The air turned sharp in the mornings, and the aspens on the high ridges started showing gold. Gideon became quietly focused in a way Evelyn recognized now, preparing for the brutal months ahead with the methodical attention of someone who'd survived too many harsh winters to take any chances. But this year was different. This year, he wasn't preparing alone. "We need more firewood than you think we do," he told Evelyn one morning while they were splitting logs behind the barn. "First winter I was up here, I thought I had plenty. Ran out in February and had to burn furniture to keep from freezing." "How much is enough?" "Enough that you look at the pile and think it's ridiculous. Then add half again more." He buried the axe in the chopping block. "Winter up here isn't like winter back east. It's not something you endure for a few months. It's something that tries to kill you every single day for half the year." Evelyn had experienced one mountain winter already, but she'd been so focused on survival and proving herself that she hadn't fully appreciated the scale of what Gideon dealt with alone. Now, watching him prepare, she understood. This wasn't caution. This was experience earned through near death and actual death. "Then we'll prepare for war," she said. Over the next 6 weeks, they worked harder than Evelyn thought possible. They cut and stacked firewood until the pile behind the cabin looked like a small fortress. They slaughtered and preserved meat. They reinforced the barn roof and sealed every crack in the cabin walls. They moved the cattle to the lower pastures where they'd have some protection from the worst storms. And through it all, Evelyn felt the difference between surviving alone and surviving together. When she was exhausted, Gideon took over. When he pushed too hard and aggravated his still recovering strength, she made him rest. They moved around each other with the efficiency of people who'd learned to read each other's limits and capabilities. One evening in early October, while they were sitting on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, a rider appeared on the trail. Evelyn's hand went instinctively to the rifle beside her chair, but Gideon touched her arm. "It's all right. That's Tom Fletcher." "Fletcher?" Evelyn stood up, ready to reach for the gun again. "Different Fletcher. Tom's the eldest brother, runs cattle on the South Range. He's got no love for his brother's rustling business." Gideon stood as the rider approached. "Evening, Tom." Tom Fletcher was older than his brother, maybe 50, with gray in his beard and the weathered look of someone who'd spent his entire life working the land. He dismounted slowly, favoring his left leg. "Gideon, Mrs. Cross." He nodded to Evelyn. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. What brings you up here?" Tom looked uncomfortable. "Came to warn you. My brother's been talking, says he's got plans for your ranch come spring. Says you humiliated him in town and he won't forget it." "Your brother's been planning things for years," Gideon said. "Hasn't worked out for him yet. This is different. He's been recruiting, got men from the mining camps, some drifters looking for work. He's building something, Gideon, and you two are isolated up here." Tom glanced at Evelyn. "Heard about what your wife did, driving them off with a rifle. That's got my brother's pride wounded worse than anything. He's the type who can't let that go." Evelyn felt cold despite the warm evening air. "How many men?" "Don't know exactly. 8, maybe 10. Enough to cause serious trouble if they coordinate." Tom shifted his weight. "I don't agree with my brother's methods, but he's still family. Can't go against him directly. But I can warn you, and I can tell you that he's planning to move in April, right after the thaw, when you're most vulnerable." "Why tell us?" Gideon asked. "If he finds out, he'll come after you too. Because what he's planning is wrong. Burning people's homes, stealing cattle, threatening women, that's not ranching, that's thuggery." Tom looked at them both seriously. "You two are good people. Don't deserve what he's planning. Figured you should know so you can prepare." After Tom left, Evelyn and Gideon sat in heavy silence. The sunset that had been beautiful minutes ago now felt ominous, a reminder that beauty in the mountains was always temporary, always surrounded by danger. 8 to 10 men, Evelyn said finally. "We can't fight that many." "No, but we can make it costly enough that they think twice." Gideon stood up and started pacing. "We've got 6 months before April. That's time to prepare, reinforce, maybe recruit some help of our own." "Who would help us?" "Everyone in Red Hollow either fears Fletcher or stays out of his business." "Not everyone." Gideon looked at her. "Rose helped you. Dr. Hale rode up here without question. Tom just warned us at risk to himself. There are people who'd stand with us if we asked. We just have to ask." Over the following weeks, they made quiet inquiries in Red Hollow. They weren't looking for gunslingers or mercenaries. They needed people who'd defend the ranch because it was the right thing to do, not because they were paid. It was a hard sell. Most people wanted nothing to do with a range war, even a small one. But slowly, they found allies. Dr. Hale offered to be on standby in case of injuries. Rose promised to keep her ears open for information about Fletcher's plans. A young rancher named William Stone, who'd been helped by Gideon years earlier, said he'd ride up if trouble started. Even Morrison, the courthouse clerk, quietly mentioned that he'd keep records of any threats or incidents in case legal action became necessary later. It wasn't an army, but it was something. Winter hit in November with a vengeance. The first storm buried the cabin in 3 feet of snow overnight, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in its buckets inside the cabin, despite the fire roaring in the hearth. This was the winter Gideon had warned her about, the one that tested everything. But this time, they were prepared. They'd stored enough food for 4 months. The firewood lasted through January without them having to ration. The cabin stayed warm, the cattle survived in their reinforced shelter, and when storms trapped them inside for days at a time, they had each other for company. Those storm-bound days revealed sides of Gideon that Evelyn hadn't seen before. He told her stories about his childhood, about learning to ranch from his father, about the dreams he'd had before Sarah and Elizabeth died. He wasn't naturally talkative, but in the forced isolation of winter storms, he opened up in ways that felt like gifts. "I wanted to be a teacher," he admitted one evening while they were both mending clothes by lamplight. "Before I met Sarah, I was studying to teach at a school back in Missouri. Loved books, loved learning. Thought I'd spend my life helping kids discover the same things." Evelyn looked up in surprise. "What changed?" "Met Sarah. She wanted a rancher, someone who could give her stability and land. So I became that. He set down the shirt he was mending. Don't regret it. I loved her. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd chosen differently. Would you have been happy? Maybe. Maybe not. Hard to know the path you didn't take. He looked at her. But I know I'm happy now. With you. With this life we're building. That's worth more than wondering about what ifs. Evelyn set aside her own mending and moved closer to him on the bench. I used to wonder what would have happened if Conrad had actually shown up in Red Hollow. If he'd married me like he promised. You think you would have been happy with him? No. I think I would have been comfortable, safe, probably miserable in ways I didn't even recognize as misery. She took Gideon's hand. Coming here was the best worst thing that ever happened to me. It broke me open, but it also showed me who I actually am underneath all the things I thought I was supposed to be. Who are you underneath? Someone strong, someone capable, someone who doesn't need rescuing. She smiled. Someone who can rescue herself. And occasionally her stubborn husband when he gets mountain fever and almost dies. Gideon pulled her close, and they sat like that while the storm raged outside and the fire kept them warm and safe. These were the moments Evelyn treasured most. Not the dramatic confrontations or the big gestures, but the quiet intimacy of two people who'd chosen each other and kept choosing each other every single day. February brought a different kind of storm. Evelyn woke one morning feeling wrong, nauseous and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with ranch work. At first, she thought she'd eaten something bad. But when the nausea continued for a week, accompanied by other symptoms she'd tried to ignore, she had to face the truth. She was pregnant. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She sat on the edge of the bed, hand pressed to her still flat stomach, and tried to process what this meant. A baby. Here, in the mountains, where winter could kill you and Fletcher's men were planning to attack in 2 months, and the nearest doctor was 3 days away. You all right? Gideon asked, coming in from his morning chores. You look pale. Evelyn opened her mouth to tell him, then closed it. How did you tell someone you were pregnant when you weren't even sure how you felt about it yourself? She'd never imagined herself as a mother, had never really thought about children beyond knowing that society expected her to want them. Just tired, she said. Didn't sleep well. He accepted the lie, which made her feel guilty. But she needed time to think, to figure out how she felt before she could talk about it. Over the next week, Evelyn wrestled with the news alone. Part of her was terrified. Pregnancy was dangerous, childbirth even more so. Women died from it all the time, even with doctors present. Up here in the mountains, the risks multiplied. And with Fletcher's attack coming in April, the timing couldn't be worse. But another part of her, a part she hadn't known existed, felt something that might have been joy. She'd built a life here, a real life, with a man she loved and land that was hers and a future that felt solid. A child would be the ultimate proof that she belonged here, that she wasn't just surviving, but actually living. She finally told Gideon on a clear evening in late February. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual they'd developed over the winter, and Evelyn just blurted it out. I'm pregnant. Gideon went completely still. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, and Evelyn's heart sank. Maybe he didn't want children. Maybe he'd only ever wanted them with Sarah. Maybe... You're pregnant, he repeated, like he was testing the words. About 2 months, I think. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. 2 months. He turned to look at her, and his expression was impossible to read. You've known for a week and didn't tell me? I needed time to think about it, to figure out how I felt. Evelyn's hands twisted in her lap. I know the timing is terrible. I know with Fletcher coming and winter barely over and everything. Gideon kissed her. Just leaned over and kissed her like she'd just given him the best news of his life. When he pulled back, he was smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile that transformed his entire face. A baby, he said. We're having a baby. You're not upset? Upset? Evelyn, this is... He stopped, struggling for words. After Sarah and Elizabeth died, I thought I'd never have a family again, thought that part of my life was over. And now you're telling me we're going to have a child? He pulled her close. I'm terrified, but I'm also happier than I've been in 10 years. Evelyn let herself relax into his embrace. I'm terrified too. Women die from this, especially out here where there's no doctor nearby. Then we'll make sure you're safe. We'll bring Dr. Hale up here before you're due. We'll prepare the cabin. We'll do whatever it takes." Gideon pulled back to look at her seriously. "You saved my life when I had mountain fever. I'll be damned if I let anything happen to you during this." "And Fletcher?" "Fletcher's attack is in April. You won't be due until September at the earliest. We'll handle him long before the baby arrives." His jaw tightened. "And if he thinks he can threaten my pregnant wife, he's about to learn exactly how dangerous I can be." March brought the thaw, and with it, the knowledge that Fletcher's attack was coming soon. Gideon sent word to their allies in Red Hollow, asking them to be ready to ride at a moment's notice. He reinforced the cabin's defenses, positioned weapons strategically, and drilled Evelyn on emergency procedures despite her pregnancy. "If shooting starts, you get to the root cellar," he told her firmly. "It's the most protected part of the property. You stay there until I come get you." "I can fight." "I know you can, but you're also carrying our child. I won't risk both of you if I can avoid it." He softened his tone. "Please, Evelyn, let me protect you this time." She hated it, but she understood. And truthfully, the pregnancy was making her more cautious than she'd ever been. Every decision now carried double weight, not just her safety, but the baby's too. April arrived with unusual warmth, melting the last of the winter snow and turning the trails to mud. Gideon stayed close to the cabin, watching the approaches, waiting for Fletcher to make his move. The tension was constant, exhausting. Every rider in the distance could be a scout. Every unusual sound could be the beginning of an attack. The attack came on April 15th, just after dawn. Evelyn was in the kitchen making breakfast when she heard horses, too many horses. She looked out the window and saw them, 8 riders coming up the trail, Fletcher in the lead. They weren't trying to hide. This was meant to intimidate. "Gideon!" she called. He was already moving, rifle in hand. "Get to the cellar, now!" "But now, Evelyn, please." She ran for the cellar, hating every step, but knowing he was right. As she descended the ladder, she heard Gideon's voice booming across the clearing. "That's far enough, Fletcher. You're trespassing." From her hiding spot, Evelyn could hear the confrontation but not see it. Fletcher's voice carried through the cellar's ventilation grate. "Just here to talk business, Cross. You've got more land than you need. Thought we might work out an arrangement." "I'm not interested in arrangements with rustlers and arsonists." Strong words from a man who's outnumbered. "I've got friends on the way. You sure you want to start something you can't finish?" Evelyn heard horses approaching from a different direction. Reinforcements. William Stone and 3 ranch hands he'd brought. Then more riders. Rose's 2 sons from town. Even Dr. Hale, carrying a rifle despite being a medical man. Fletcher had expected to intimidate Gideon with numbers. Instead, he found himself facing nearly equal forces. "This isn't over," Fletcher snarled. "Yes, it is." That was a new voice. Tom Fletcher, riding up to join the confrontation. "Brother or not, I won't let you burn people's homes. You want to fight Gideon, you go through me first." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Fletcher was outmaneuvered, and he knew it, but his pride wouldn't let him back down gracefully. "You're protecting him over your own blood?" "I'm protecting what's right over what's wrong. There's a difference." Tom positioned his horse between Fletcher and the cabin. "Turn around. Leave these people alone, or we're going to have a problem that ends with the sheriff involved." Fletcher looked around at the assembled ranchers and townspeople, people who'd chosen to stand with Gideon and Evelyn instead of looking the other way. His face twisted with rage, but he wasn't stupid enough to start a shooting war he couldn't win. "This isn't finished," he spat. "Yeah, it is," Gideon said calmly. "You come on my land again, you won't leave it alive. That's not a threat. That's a promise." Fletcher wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following. The tension didn't break until they disappeared completely from view. Evelyn climbed out of the cellar to find Gideon surrounded by their allies, people who'd ridden up the mountain to help defend a ranch they had no obligation to protect. Rose's sons were joking with William Stone. Dr. Hale was checking to make sure nobody had been injured. Tom Fletcher was talking quietly with Gideon, apologizing for his brother's behavior. "You all right?" Gideon asked when he saw her. "We're fine." She put a hand on her stomach. "Both of us." Relief washed over his face. Then he turned to the assembled group. "I can't thank you all enough for coming, for standing with us." "You've helped most of us at one point or another," William said. "Figured we owed you." "Besides," Rose's oldest son added, Your wife's got a reputation for shooting at people who cause trouble. Wanted to see if the stories were true. That got a laugh, breaking the remaining tension. They celebrated that night, an impromptu gathering at the cabin with food and whiskey and stories. Evelyn watched Gideon laugh with people who'd become friends instead of just neighbors, saw him relax in a way he probably hadn't since before Sarah died, and realized something profound. They weren't isolated anymore. They'd built a community, not a large one, but a real one. People who'd show up when it mattered. The next morning, after everyone had left, Gideon found Evelyn in the garden. "Told you we weren't alone," he said. "You were right, about a lot of things." She straightened up, brushing dirt from her hands. "I keep thinking about something Rose said once. She said the frontier is where broken people go to become whole again. I didn't understand it then, but I do now." "What changed?" "I realized I'm not broken anymore. Or maybe I am, but the broken parts don't define me." She looked at the mountains surrounding them. "I came here thinking I needed someone to save me. Turns out I just needed space to save myself." "And then you saved me," Gideon said quietly. "We saved each other. That's what makes this work." The months that followed were the happiest of Evelyn's life. Her pregnancy progressed without complications, though morning sickness made her miserable through June. Gideon was attentive without being overbearing, helping when she needed it and giving her space when she didn't. They expanded the cabin, adding a small room that would become the nursery. They talked about names and made plans, and argued about whether they'd teach a daughter to shoot as young as a son. In August, they rode down to Red Hollow one last time before the baby arrived. Evelyn wanted to make sure everything was in order. Supplies purchased, Dr. Hale confirmed for September, legal documents updated to reflect the baby as heir to the ranch. They were leaving the courthouse when Evelyn heard her name called. "Evelyn Mercer?" She turned to see a well-dressed woman in expensive travel clothes standing near a carriage. It took Evelyn a moment to recognize her. Martha Whitmore, Conrad's sister. They'd met once, briefly back in Philadelphia when Conrad was making his elaborate promises about frontier life. "It's Evelyn Cross now," she said carefully. "Can I help you?" Martha looked her up and down, taking in the practical frontier clothing, the visible pregnancy, the rifle casually held in Evelyn's hand. "I heard you married. I had to see for myself if the rumors were true." "What rumors?" "That my brother abandoned you and you somehow ended up with Gideon Cross." Martha's tone was impossible to read. "Conrad told me he'd made arrangements for you, sent property and money as compensation." "He did." I accepted the apology. Evelyn shifted her weight, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "Is there something you need, Mrs. Whitmore?" "I wanted to apologize. For my brother. For my family." Martha looked genuinely distressed. "Conrad was wrong to treat you that way, to make promises and then run. It was cowardly and cruel." "Apology accepted. Is that all?" "I also wanted to see if you needed anything. Financial help, perhaps, or connections in Denver. I have resources that might—" "I don't need anything," Evelyn interrupted, not unkindly. "I have everything I need right here." Martha followed Evelyn's gaze to where Gideon stood talking with William Stone near the horses. "You're happy with him? Truly?" "More than I ever thought possible." "And the baby?" "Is healthy and due in September." Martha was quiet for a moment. "You know, I told Conrad he was making a mistake. Told him you looked like someone who could handle frontier life better than half the men out here. He didn't listen." She smiled sadly. "I'm glad you proved him wrong. And I'm glad you found someone who appreciates what he couldn't see." After Martha left, Evelyn stood in the middle of Red Hollow's main street and felt the full weight of how far she'd come. A year ago, she'd been the town joke, the abandoned bride nobody wanted. Now she was Evelyn Cross, wife of a respected rancher, pregnant with her first child, and carrying herself with confidence that came from knowing her own worth. "Ready to head home?" Gideon asked, walking over. "Yeah, let's go home." Their daughter was born on September 23rd during a thunderstorm that rattled the cabin walls and made Dr. Hale mutter about dramatic timing. Labor was long and brutal, 18 hours of pain that made Evelyn understand why women feared childbirth. But when it was over, when Dr. Hale placed the screaming, red-faced baby in her arms, Evelyn felt something she'd never experienced before. Complete, unconditional love. "She's perfect," Gideon whispered, standing beside the bed with tears running down his scarred face. "She's angry," Evelyn corrected, watching the baby's furious little face. "Good. She'll need that to survive up here. They named her Sarah Elizabeth Cross, honoring Gideon's first family while claiming her as part of their new one. It felt right, like bringing the past and present together without letting either overwhelm the other. The first year of Sarah Elizabeth's life was chaos. Sleepless nights, constant worry, the overwhelming responsibility of keeping a tiny human alive in brutal frontier conditions. But it was also joy, watching her discover snow for the first time, hearing her laugh when Gideon made silly faces, seeing her grow strong and healthy despite the harsh environment. And through it all, Evelyn and Gideon continued building their life together. They weren't perfect. They argued sometimes about money, about risk, about how to handle Sarah Elizabeth's education as she grew older. But they always came back to the same foundation: respect, partnership, and the understanding that they'd both been broken and had chosen to heal together. 2 years after Sarah Elizabeth was born, Evelyn stood on the porch watching Gideon teach their daughter how to feed the chickens. At 3 years old, Sarah Elizabeth was fearless, completely comfortable with the animals and the mountains, and the isolation that had nearly destroyed Evelyn when she first arrived. Rose rode up the trail, a rare visit that meant news. "Morning, Evelyn. Got something you'll want to hear." Good news or bad? Depends on your perspective. Rose dismounted and accepted the coffee Evelyn offered. "Fletcher's dead. Tried to rustle cattle from a ranch in Montana, and the rancher shot him. His men scattered after that." Evelyn felt a complicated mix of relief and sadness. "I won't pretend to mourn him, but I'm sorry it ended that way." "Some men make their own endings," Rose said. "He spent his whole life taking shortcuts and hurting people. It was only a matter of time before it caught up with him." She watched Sarah Elizabeth toddle after her father. Speaking of endings, heard Conrad Whitmore got married, some society woman from Boston. Apparently she's exactly the kind of delicate flower he thought he wanted. Good for him. I hope he's happy. "You mean that?" "I do. Conrad and I weren't right for each other. What he did was cruel, but it pushed me towards something better." Evelyn looked out at the mountains. "If he'd shown up in Red Hollow like he promised, I'd probably be miserable in some ranch house right now, playing the role of dutiful wife and hating every minute. Instead, I got this. Got Gideon. Got Sarah Elizabeth. Got a life I actually want to live." Rose studied her. "You know, when I first saw you in that saloon, crying over your suitcase, I thought you'd be on the first stagecoach back east. Never expected you to last a week, let alone become the toughest ranch wife in the territory." "I didn't expect it either," Evelyn smiled. "Turns out, I'm good at things I never knew I could do. Just needed someone to give me the chance to figure it out." After Rose left, Evelyn joined Gideon and Sarah Elizabeth in the chicken coop. Their daughter was carefully dropping feed for the hens, completely focused on the task. "She's got your determination," Gideon said, watching her with obvious pride, "and your stubbornness." "Poor kid doesn't stand a chance." Evelyn laughed and leaned against him. "Think we're doing all right? As parents?" "I think we're doing the best we can. That's all anyone can do." He wrapped an arm around her. "She's healthy, happy, and learning to be strong. That's what matters." "What about when she's older? When she asks about why we live so isolated, or why Mama has a different accent than everyone else in town, or why the other kids' mothers look different than me? Then we'll tell her the truth, that you came here broken and became whole, that strength comes in all shapes and sizes, that the opinions of people who've never struggled don't matter nearly as much as the respect of people who have." He kissed the top of her head. "We'll teach her to judge people by their actions, not their appearance, to value capability over conformity, to know her own worth regardless of what anyone else says." That's a lot of pressure to put on a 3-year-old. "We've got time, and we'll teach by example." He gestured at the ranch around them. "This place exists because you refused to give up, because you learned and grew and fought for what you wanted. That's the best lesson we can give her." 5 years later, Evelyn stood in the same spot watching Sarah Elizabeth, now 8 years old, practice shooting with Gideon. Their daughter had her father's natural skill with firearms, and her mother's stubborn refusal to quit until she got things right. They'd had 2 more children in the intervening years, a son named Thomas, who was 5 and constantly getting into everything, and another daughter named Grace, who was 3 and already showing signs of being even more stubborn than her siblings combined. The ranch had grown too. They'd expanded their cattle operation, hired 2 permanent ranch hands, and built a new barn that was the envy of neighboring ranchers. Evelyn had started a small school for the handful of ranch children in the area, teaching them reading and arithmetic in the cabin during winter months. Life wasn't perfect. There were still hard winters, difficult neighbors, and the constant challenges of frontier existence. But it was theirs, built from nothing by two people who'd refused to accept the limitations others tried to place on them. William Stone rode up the trail with his own family in tow, his wife and 3 children coming for Sunday dinner, a tradition they'd established over the years. Other families would arrive too: Tom Fletcher and his family, Dr. Hale and his new wife, even Rose and her sons. The isolated cabin where Gideon Cross had once hidden from the world had become the heart of a small community. People gathered here not just because Gideon and Evelyn were good hosts, but because the Cross Ranch represented something important: the possibility of redemption, the power of second chances, and the truth that broken things could be repaired into something stronger than they'd ever been originally. "Ma, can I show Thomas how to feed the chickens?" Sarah Elizabeth asked, appearing at Evelyn's elbow. "If he promises not to chase them like last time." "I won't chase them," Thomas protested from where he was helping his father set up tables outside. "Go ahead then, but watch your sister." As her children ran off to complete their chores, Evelyn felt a hand on her shoulder. Gideon stood behind her, surveying the bustling activity of families arriving and children playing. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked. "That we've come a long way from you offering me a job and me desperately accepting?" "Something like that." He turned her to face him. "I was thinking that I'm grateful for Fletcher being a coward and abandoning you, for you being brave enough to take a chance on a scarred rancher with more ghosts than future, for every hard winter and difficult summer that taught us we could survive anything as long as we survived it together." Evelyn kissed him, a quick kiss, casual with the comfort of years together. "I'm grateful too. Even for the hard parts, especially for the hard parts. They made us who we are." That evening, after dinner had been eaten and stories had been told and guests had departed back to their own homes, Evelyn sat on the porch with her family. Sarah Elizabeth was reading to her younger siblings by lamplight. Gideon was whittling something that would eventually become a toy for Grace. "Tell us again how you and Pa met," Thomas demanded, the way he did at least once a week. "You've heard this story 100 times, Evelyn protested, "but I like it. Tell it again." So Evelyn told them, carefully editing the parts about humiliation and desperation into a story about bravery and choices. She told them about arriving in Red Hollow and finding nobody waiting, about Gideon appearing like a storm cloud and offering her a job, about learning to survive in the mountains and becoming someone stronger than she'd ever imagined. "And then you fell in love?" Grace asked, her eyes wide. "Eventually. First we became friends, then partners. Then we realized we didn't want to be apart." Evelyn looked at Gideon. "Love's not always the lightning bolt people write about in stories. Sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it's just finding someone who sees you, really sees you, and chooses you anyway." "That's boring," Thomas declared. "That's real," Gideon corrected, "which is better than boring." Later that night, after the children were asleep and the cabin was quiet, Evelyn and Gideon sat together on the porch like they'd done countless times before. The mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky, eternal and indifferent. "You ever think about what would have happened if Conrad had shown up that day?" Gideon asked. "Sometimes, but not with regret." Evelyn took his hand. "I think I would have been comfortable with Conrad, maybe even content eventually, but I wouldn't have been me. I would have been whoever he needed me to be." She squeezed his fingers. "You let me become who I actually am. That's worth more than all the comfort in the world." "Who are you, Evelyn Cross?" She thought about that, really thought about it. "I'm someone who's strong because I had to be. Someone who learned that worth isn't about being wanted, it's about being capable. Someone who turned rejection into redirection and ended up somewhere better than where she was heading." She looked at him. "I'm someone who proved that the woman nobody wanted became the woman everyone respected. Not because I changed to fit someone else's standards, but because I stopped trying to." Gideon pulled her close. "That's the best answer you could have given." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd been broken by life and had somehow managed to put each other back together. The frontier had tested them, would continue testing them as long as they lived in these brutal mountains. But they'd passed every test so far, and they'd pass the next ones too. Because that's what survivors did. They adapted, they persevered, They built lives worth living in places that tried to kill them. And sometimes, if they were very lucky, they found someone who saw their strength instead of their flaws. Someone who offered choices instead of demands. Someone who stood beside them through storms and celebrated with them during sunshine. Evelyn had come to Wyoming territory looking for rescue. Instead, she'd found something better. Herself. In all her complicated, imperfect, undeniably strong glory. And she'd found a partner who loved her not despite who she was, but because of it. That was the real happy ending. Not perfection, but authenticity. Not ease, but purpose. Not rescue, but partnership. The woman nobody wanted had become the woman who wanted herself. And that made all the difference in the world. Years later, when people asked Evelyn Cross about her life, she'd smile and tell them the truth. I came west to marry a wealthy rancher and ended up marrying a mountain instead. Best decision I ever made. And she'd mean every word. Because the mountains had demanded everything from her. Strength, courage, resilience, and the willingness to completely remake herself. And in return, they'd given her everything that mattered. Purpose, pride, and proof that she was capable of far more than anyone, including herself, had ever believed. The mail-order bride who'd arrived in Red Hollow, carrying nothing but a suitcase and desperate hope, had become Evelyn Cross, rancher, mother, teacher, and the toughest woman in the Wyoming territory. And she'd done it all by refusing to accept anyone else's definition of who she was supposed to be. That was her legacy. Not the ranch, not the cattle, not even the children who'd carry her name forward. Her legacy was the proof that broken things could be rebuilt, that rejection could lead to redirection, and that the woman society discarded as worthless could become absolutely invaluable if given the space and support to discover her own strength. She'd needed someone to give her that space. Gideon had provided it, but she'd done the actual work of transformation herself. And that, more than anything else, was what made her story worth telling.